Chapter 1043. When the undead sneak attack turned into a frontal attack, the situation on the battlefield of Fedan Port quickly changed. The Liches used their air force for the first time. There were countless sounds of wings flapping in the darkness. The Kurlut soldiers on the city wall were still puzzled. What was that sound? But the young men of the White Lion Guards beside them had a drastic change in expression. Get down! They pulled their colleagues from the Empire to the ground and then shrunk behind the battlements. The Coast Guards were dizzy from the fall. Before they could curse, a terrible rain of bones fell from the sky. Countless skeletal vultures fell from the sky and crashed onto the city wall. The soldiers who were hit by them had broken bones or died on the spot. A Cruz soldier who reacted slowly was hit head-on. His eyes bulged out, and his lifeless body flew a few meters away before landing on the ground. The skeletal vultures exploded immediately after landing on the ground, turning into a terrifying rain of fragments. The Coast Guards on the city wall who could not dodge in time suffered heavy casualties. The veterans of the White Lion Guards who had participated in the War of the Black Rose and the Battle of Tosankad were fine. The new soldiers and the Cruz soldiers who had never seen the undead were unlucky, especially the Coast Guards who were not beside the White Lion Guards. For example, the independent team of Coast Guards who were responsible for defending the tower. Out of 30 people, 7 of them were killed on the spot, and 12 of them were seriously injured. Other than the 3 people in the tower who were unharmed, the rest of them were more or less injured. Among them, Knight Wright and his 2 attendants who were commanding on the top of the tower were also on the list of the dead. This battle order could be said to have been wiped out on the spot. In addition, 1/3 of the Coast Guard's archers were killed in this wave of attack. After receiving the casualty report, the others saw Baron Ludwig's eyes twitching. However, the skeletal vulture's suicide attack only worked once. When they were about to dive into the air for the second time, they collided with the gargoyles stationed at Fedan Port. The Liches below were still waiting for the second wave of attack to work, but suddenly, they saw countless shredded skeletal vultures falling from the sky like rain. Their corpses instantly accumulated on the ground of the battlefield. Gargoyles! When Sok saw this scene, he immediately understood what the skeletal vultures had encountered. The gargoyles of the Erewhon people had appeared more than once in the intelligence reports. The earliest report about them was when the arrogant Count Tonajul attacked the Black Sword Fortress. However, this army later suffered heavy casualties when they encountered the dragon army of the Jorgandi Ridge people. There should not be many of them left. However, Sok did not know that when Tonajul's fleet arrived, the Bugas had already replenished the number of gargoyles for Brando. He only saw a huge creature falling from the sky not long after. It was a gargoyle whose wings had been blown off. It fell heavily into the middle of a group of skeletons, crushing them into pieces. However, Sok was not heartbroken. Instead, he was a little happy because after the first gargoyle fell, it quickly caused a chain reaction. This confirmed his guess that Erewhon people did not have many gargoyles left. Otherwise, they would not have been unable to withstand the siege of the skeletal vultures so quickly. One must know that the skeletal vultures were only an unorthodox unit in Wound. Even the undead in Madara did not count them as an official combat force. The gargoyles, on the other hand, were a genuine reconnaissance flying unit of the Bugas. The difference in combat strength between the two was not reasonable. If it were not for the huge disparity in numbers, the gargoyles would not have started to cause so many casualties so quickly. The battle in the sky seemed to have quickly gained the upper hand, but the 2 squadrons of White Lion Guards and Coast Guards on the ground firmly blocked the skeletons on the path to the sea cliff. They even threatened the southern wall of the fortress from time to time. If it was a real battle between the undead of Madara, they would have arranged for a Black Knight to open up the situation, or at the very least, launch a charge of skeletal cavalry, or gather as many Liches as possible to blast a path through the humans. But now they did not even have a single skeletal cavalry, let alone a Black Knight. The few Liches had become frontline commanders, each of them commanding hundreds of skeletons. As for gathering them to act as a long-range attack echelon, it was impossible to even think about it. As for the undead, they did have a group of Liches as magicians, but the frontline Liches still counted on them to be of great use, so it was impossible for them to be exposed so quickly. After all, the Coast Guards also had a group of magicians. In a close combat situation, whoever was exposed first would be dealt a fatal blow. Therefore, the only thing that could support the skeletons on the ground was the limited number of skeleton archers. But they were only happy for a while, and soon, they were retaliated by the scattered magicians on the enemy's wall. Fireballs flew across the battlefield a few hundred meters and exploded on the wall. The skeleton archers who lacked protection immediately suffered heavy casualties, and the liches had no choice but to withdraw them. As the battle continued, the skeletons were forced to retreat until they were out of the range of the enemy's archers. This was because there were too many of them, and they did not have to worry about consumption at all. It was also because of this reason that the liches were not worried about losing the battle head-on. They had tens of thousands of soldiers, but they could not use their full strength on the battlefield. Most of the undead were still trapped in the valley behind. In fact, less than 1/3 of them had joined the battle. Of course, the undead did not want to spend half a day just to take down the main wall of Fathom Port, because the battle in the sky seemed to have come to an end. The last gargoyle finally fell from the sky under the siege and suicidal attacks of the vultures. It crashed heavily on the southern wall of Fort Seacliff, creating a hole in the wall. At the same time, it was torn into pieces. After losing their last opponent, the skeletal vultures could finally invade the airspace of Fathom Port once again, launching attacks on the Coast Guards and the White Lion Guards. Under such circumstances, Cruz's people had no choice but to withdraw their archers. Without the cover of long-range attacks, no matter how brave the White Lion Guards and the Coast Guards were, human strength was limited. They would eventually lose their position on the sandbar. If there was only the outer wall of Fathom Port, it would be much easier to take it down. Moreover, the skeletal vultures could also attack the humans who were fighting with the skeletons. After all, the undead did not have to worry about consumption. With the loss of air control, the situation on the battlefield seemed to have become extremely disadvantageous for the human side in an instant. However, at this moment, a mile or two away from the main wall of Fathom Port, there was another army that was quietly stationed. There was a small shabby monastery. In front of the monastery there was a square. The low buildings in front of the square had been demolished, so the people in the dark could clearly see the situation of the battle in the direction of the city wall. The shadows of the people on the city wall were crisscrossing, and the deafening battle cries could be heard from afar. In the crowd, the Shire silently raised his head and looked at the situation in the sky. At this time, a messenger trotted to his side and whispered to him, "Sir the Shire, it's almost time." The Shire turned his head and looked at him. He nodded and said, "Leave it to me. Tell Miss Delphian not to worry." After saying that, he opened his 5 fingers, and an exquisite card appeared in his palm, spinning slowly. At every moment the energy is changing its form. With the astral world as its home, the ultimate form of the energy life display, Ether Dragon. The Shire loudly chanted, and a huge door of light opened behind the Shire. Plankton of all shapes and sizes swam out of these portals. The number of plankton was even more spectacular than the number of plankton at the Black Sword Fortress. Everyone in the square looked at this scene with great respect. This was the power of magic. Although they did not know that the Shire had borrowed the power of a planeswalker, at this moment, their hearts were filled with a deep longing for power. Many years later, those masters who had walked out of Valhalla would still vividly recall the scene today. However, many of them would die without understanding how Charles had managed to summon those ether creatures to the material world. Nor could they figure out what level of strength and realm their teacher had reached back then. Regardless of whether they understood it or not, countless ether dragons still rose into the sky at the first moment. The skeletal vultures that had just arrived in the sky above Fathom Harbor were immediately met with misfortune. Even the Griffin Knight at the Black Sword Fortress was no match for the ether dragons, let alone the skeletal vultures. The battle in the sky immediately took a 180-degree turn. The corpses of the skeletal vultures quickly fell like rain. The density of their corpses was at least 2 to 3 times greater than when they were fighting against the gargoyles. Sock, who was still standing on the southern wall of the Seacliff Fortress, saw the appearance of the ether dragons and knew that the undead's air force was done for. However, this was also a signal that showed that Fathom Harbor was almost out of tricks, except for Greysword St. Mephistopheles, who had not yet appeared. However, he was not worried about this. Her Majesty the Queen would help them solve this problem, as long as the other party dared to appear. What came next was the real feast. Sok felt relieved. At least until now, all the situations were within his expectations. This proved that the plan was quite successful. At this time, the undead's necromancer group finally appeared. This was because the undead commander had no choice but to use them to suppress the ether dragons in the sky. Otherwise, if they completely lost control of the air, it would definitely be a nightmare for the skeletons on the battlefield between the Seacliff Fortress and Fathom Harbor. It might even be difficult to defend the Seacliff Fortress. In just half an hour, the humans had broken through the southern wall of the Seacliff Fortress several times, threatening the safety of the fortress. However, the undead's necromancer commander played a little trick. It divided the necromancer group that was formed by the necromancers into two. It wanted to lure the humans' necromancer group to open fire and expose its existence. It had to be said that its cunning little trick really worked. When the necromancers launched an attack on the ether dragons in the sky, the humans' necromancer group, who was lying in ambush behind the city wall, immediately poured magic on the necromancers, who were almost a mile away. For these necromancers, a catastrophe instantly befell them. Fireballs, meteorites, and hailstones fell on their heads as if they were free. These necromancers, who did not have any protective abilities, were directly blasted into pieces. Then, as if the humans' necromancers were still not at ease, they used magic to crush them again. The 2 rounds of magic from the humans made Sok overjoyed. Of course, he already knew the necromancer's strategy. 2 rounds of magic from Fathom Harbor meant that the other party would not be able to fight back for a short period of time. This was undoubtedly great news for the undead. Sure enough, the undead commander did not intend to give up this opportunity. It immediately ordered another group of necromancers to attack the humans' necromancer group. Unfortunately, it and Sok had only guessed the beginning but not the end. The necromancers encountered the Shire, who was half a planeswalker, with a green poisonous gas bomb. The Shire was not surprised by the little trick of the undead. He showed another card, Magic Refraction. Magic Refraction Law II Water 3 Spell Pay X Mana, Wizard. With the target spell as the target, it will choose X new targets. After this card is used, it will be shuffled into the deck. Your magic is under my control, Steeple Guard, Odu. The result was predictable. Although the undead had a high tolerance for poison, having their spells reflected was enough to make them flustered. Moreover, they had made the same mistake as the humans. In order to ensure that they could completely eliminate the human sorcerers, they had also used all their black magic. However, the humans had come prepared, and the undead had no way to counter them. As a result, when they finally recovered from their own attacks, they were greeted with a calamity of annihilation. Seeing that the necromancer's group was completely destroyed, there was finally a burst of cheers on the city wall. The mage's beautiful counterattack cheered everyone up. The morale of the Coast Guards and the White Lion Guards was greatly boosted. Even Count Alcorn and Baron Ludwig, the city lord of Fathom Harbor, who were watching the battle from the city wall, were greatly relieved. The latter's gloomy face finally eased a little. Erwin's wizards are really good, Count Alcorn could not help but praise in his excitement. Wait! Eugenie noticed something unusual at this time. Look over there. Oh my god! A few nobles beside Delphian looked in the direction that Eugenie pointed and could not help but exclaim. The sea, the undead are attacking from the sea. Of course, the undead did not have a navy. At this moment, under the effect of the disorder of chaos, the entire coastal area of Silver Valley Bay was frozen due to the harsh low temperature. However, due to inertia, both sides of the battle did not think of attacking from the frozen sea at the beginning. At this moment, the undead whose attacks were blocked seemed to have run out of tricks and had to find a way out from the desperate situation. However, the way they found a way out hit the weak spot of Fathom Harbor. Chapter 1044. Fathom Harbor did not seem to have thought of setting up a defense on the sea. At this moment, the entire Fathom Harbor and a few miles of the coastal coast were covered with ice. The undead could spread their army on the frozen sea, and the humans could not stop them at all, because they did not have enough troops. Almost all the noble officers on the city wall changed their faces. Once the undead spread out tens of thousands of troops on the sea, how could they resist? With less than 2,000 Coast Guards in Fathom Harbor, plus Erwin's White Lion Guards, which were even smaller in number. Fortunately, They were not scared out of their wits because the eldest prince was still in the city. The nobles turned to Delphian and suggested, "Miss Delphian, call back the troops outside the city. We can only fight them in the streets." "Fight in the streets?" Delphian shook her head slowly. In the darkness, her firm gaze seemed to be able to pass through the entire battlefield. The cold rain hit the uninjured half of her face, and her smooth face was faintly pale. The Prime Minister's daughter replied firmly, "It's not time yet. Miss Eugenie, you take the others down the city wall first. Baron Ludwig, you can go down first too." Enide stood in the rain. "Miss Delphian, you're not coming with us?" "No," Delphian replied. "I said it's not time yet. Count Alcorn, you stay too. I heard that you've experienced the Holy War. This battle is probably nothing to you." Count Alcorn was slightly startled. This sentence seemed to arouse the infinite pride in his heart. He recalled his decades of military experience. Compared to that, this battle was indeed nothing. "Okay, I'll stay," he replied, then turned to Baron Ludwig and said, "Mr. Baron, you can go down first. It won't be so safe on the city wall next." "What?" Baron Ludwig was very dissatisfied. "Do I look like someone who's afraid of death?" "Baron, you don't have to be stubborn." Seeing that Count Alcon's attitude didn't seem to be fake, the old mayor of Fatantport seemed to have loosened up a little. After all, he wasn't a young man. After being in the rain for a while, he felt that he couldn't stand it anymore. So he nodded and followed the others down the city wall. A young priest walked past the people who were walking down the city wall, and hurriedly came to Count Alcorn. "My lords, the ceremony and artifacts are ready. But the solar eclipse will affect the power of the golden flame and greatly reduce the power of the holy spell." Bishop Jorf asked if we should postpone the ritual spell. Yalfo had been promoted by Frontline to be the Bishop of East Metz. As for the original bishop, he was stationed in Fordham, and that place was currently under the control of the Silver Queen. "What did Miss Sidney say?" Delphian asked. "Lady Sidney says she believes in Count Tonagel." "Then my answer is, I'm the same," Delphian replied. She raised her head in the rain and looked silently at the top of the cliff. The rain and snow fluttered, and the bare rocks were soon covered with ice and snow. Doors of light were slowly opening in the void, and figures wearing holy robes and holding scepters were stepping out from them. The priests came to the edge of the cliff one by one. The icy wind blew at the hem of their robes. They slowly raised the scepters in their hands. A ray of golden light seemed to break through the clouds, piercing through the darkness and descending from the sky. It seemed to resonate with the light and reflected on the scepters. Countless scepters shone in the darkness, connecting into one. And in the center of this golden light, Sidney was looking down at the entire battlefield. The fierce battle below the sea cliff was reflected in her platinum eyes. Her expression was solemn as she slowly stretched out her hand and pressed down on the void below. The attack of the undead was blocked again. Erwin's people were not defenseless on the ice. The skeleton army encountered the stone puppets that the Bugas gave to Brando. Although there were not many of them, it made Sock, who was on the wall, feel a strong sense of vigilance in his heart. Why haven't the Bugas sent out their fleet yet? He raised his head and looked in the direction of the port. The direction of the airport of Fulton Port was dark. The solar eclipse had brought convenience to the movement of the undead army, but things in the world were often not perfect. At this time, a scout knight finally arrived from the rear. This young man brought the decision of the White Legion to Sock. "Captain Knight Sock, after a quarter of an hour, whether the Bugas fleet appears or not, the White Legion will launch an attack on time." "Why? Don't we have to wait a little longer?" "But my target is the Bugas fleet." Sock was even more surprised. "Sir Knight thinks that we have wasted too much time. The Bugas may have seen through this. We have to force them to show up," the young man said. Sock nodded helplessly. If that was the case, the effect of the sneak attack would not be achieved. But the battle at Fulton Port had indeed made him vigilant. He also agreed with the view of the commander of the White Legion's Griffin Legion, Sir Ehrlich. Previously, the Human Mage Regiment's counterattack in Fulton Port was very decisive, directly causing the undead army to lose the ability to provide long-range magic support. That scene immediately aroused his previous suspicions. It was very likely that the other party was prepared. But if that was the case, why did the other party abandon Fulton Port? A faint sense of uneasiness lingered in his heart. However, at this moment, the undead army had completely spread out on the ice and was entangled with the stone puppets at Fulton Port. Between Fulton Port and the outer wall of Fulton, the two sides on the battlefield were locked in a fierce battle. It was impossible to retreat. At this time, the only thing they could do was to continue attacking until the winner was decided. And it was at this moment that a thunderous sound suddenly rang out. Rumble, rumble, rumble. The sound was like a giant beast breaking out of the ground under the ground. It resounded throughout the entire battlefield and instantly reached the ears of everyone on both sides of the battle. What's that sound? Oh my God, look at the sea. Sock was standing on the southern wall of Fulton Port at this moment. He suddenly widened his eyes and looked in the direction of the bay of Fulton Port as if he had seen a ghost. In the sacred and solemn hall, an angel seemed to be hanging on the dark and deep vault, silently watching everyone below, causing the hall to be silent. After the choir sang a hymn for a while, they went to the back to rest. Many citizens were praying silently in their chairs, and the sound of fighting from the direction of the port could be heard here. It was somewhat illusory, as if it was something that happened in another world. The human face on the gate of the fossa sanctum looked at the sullen Haruz not far away. Hey little guy, you don't look very happy. The little prince looked up at it listlessly. It was called Yalfo, the same name as the host of this sanctum. This was what it said. I also want to fight, but they always look down on me. Yalfo, am I particularly useless? No, I don't think so. That's because you're the crown prince. You know, identity is always very important to humans. Even if it's a gate, there's a distinction between high and low. Just like me, I'm the gate of the sanctum. Compared to those shabby civilian doors, I'm much more precious. I think those monks won't let me be damaged so easily. But it's not like that. Prince Lenoret had the experience of taking the lead, and my teacher often taught me that as the future king of Erewhon, I have the need to protect my people from harm. But everyone is fighting for the future of Erewhon, and I can only stay here. I don't understand why. Haruz said loudly. Well, let me think. Yalfo looked thoughtful. Maybe it's like this. Maybe you'll want to hear my story. Hearing the story, the little prince was a little interested and looked curiously at the human face on the gate of the sanctum. You know, when I was young. Wait, how can a gate be young? Haruz doubted. Don't interrupt, because at that time I was not a gate but a teak. To be exact, a sapling. At that time, I was not entrusted with any important task. Yalfo was not really angry at being interrupted. In fact, it was the opposite. Haruz's seriousness made it very happy. It took more than 10 minutes to tell the story of how a teak tree grew, was cut down, and finally was made into the gate of the Forza Sanctum. This lengthy story was full of meaningless nonsense and imagination, but Haruz listened very attentively. In the end it concluded. In short, what I want to say is that gold will shine wherever it is. Just like when I was still hanging out with those mediocre guys in the mountains, I already deeply understood this. That's why I've achieved what I have today. Do you understand, little guy? Thank you, Yalfo. I understand what you mean. Haruz did not question the fact that the latter's so-called achievement was actually being made into the gate of the sanctum. He said excitedly, You mean when I grow up I'll be a real man? Yalfo was stunned. Well, it's not that you can't understand it that way. Anyway, it's good that it's helpful to you, little guy. Thank you so much. Haruz was very excited. Yalfo, you've helped me a lot. Wait, what do you want to do? Haruz turned around, his beautiful silver-gray eyes sparkling. I want to grow up right now. A quarter of an hour later, a slim figure sneaked out from the back door of the sanctum. This was undoubtedly a beautiful half-elf girl, with a slender neck and picturesque eyebrows. She wore a somewhat old monk's robe, and her silver hair was scattered behind her head, casually tied into a long ponytail. Under the hair tips, pointed ears were exposed, but her face was flushed, and she looked a little nervous. Her temperament was weak, as if she would be blown away by the wind. As soon as the girl ran out of the church, she was caught red-handed by the soldiers of the White Lion Guards outside. When the young people from Tonajal saw the girl, they were so shocked that they almost jumped up. Your Royal Highness? No, I'm not. Haruz was stunned for a moment. Then he understood something. His face was slightly red, and he hurriedly waved his hand helplessly. I'm not the princess. Never in his wildest dreams would he have thought that the accelerated growth spell, which was classified as a transformational magic, would not only speed up his growth, but also make his hair grow longer. His original clothes were also torn apart. It was not easy for him to find such a cultivator's robe, but the only flaw was the current situation. No, Your Royal Highness? The soldiers looked at Haruz suspiciously. In their view, the girl in front of them was clearly the eldest princess of Erewhon Grafine. No, I mean. Haruz saw that the soldiers had become a little suspicious, and he secretly felt that something was wrong. He quickly changed his words. Yes, I'm the sister of the princess. My name is Yesu. Fosha. I'm secretly following the envoy this time. Princess Fosha? Her Royal Highness Grafine has a sister? The young people of the White Lion Guards were suddenly at a loss. Most of them were just young people of the Tanajal and Menta generation before joining Brando, or at most the children of small nobles. Although they knew about Princess Grafine and Prince Haruz, they did not know much about the members of the royal family. Besides, Haruz's current appearance was really the same as his sister's, so it was hard not to believe. After a moment of consideration, the soldiers confirmed the authenticity of the princess in front of them. Not to mention other things, the temperament of a member of the royal family on her body could not be faked. Your Royal Highness Princess Fosha, they quickly asked respectfully, what orders do you have? Yes, Haruz breathed a sigh of relief. Although the development of the current situation was a little beyond his expectations, it was still developing in a good direction. He quickly replied, quickly take me to the front line. Go to the front line? The soldiers looked at each other. Your Royal Highness, should we ask for the Lord's opinion? No need to trouble, teacher. Haruz was shocked and quickly shook his head. This. The soldiers of the White Lion Guards were staring at the sweaty and panicking little princess in confusion. But suddenly, a loud rumbling sound spread throughout the entire Fathom Harbor. Everyone's attention was immediately attracted, including Haruz. They turned their heads and looked in the direction of the loud noise in bewilderment. The sound was like rolling thunder, continuous and accompanied by cracking sounds. It was like a giant beast breaking out of the ground. In an instant, the entire earth trembled. What's going on? What's that sound? Someone in the crowd asked in surprise. It seems to be coming from the harbor. Haruz suddenly let out a low cry. He looked at the east of Fathom Harbor in shock, the direction of the sublime inland sea. A dazzling light was slowly rising from the darkness. Sok looked at the scene that was happening in front of him dumbfounded. The eternal darkness was fading, and a dazzling red sun was rising from the sea level. The storm on the outer sea seemed to have subsided in an instant. The sunlight pierced through the dark clouds like sharp swords. The lightning and illusions under the clouds disappeared, and the darkness was receding from the entire land. Meanwhile, in the coastal waters, the thick layer of ice was melting and cracking apart. Terrifying cracks appeared on the ice, as if the ice that had never melted in 10,000 years was breaking apart from the middle. The undead army on the ice was facing a calamity of annihilation almost instantly. Everyone witnessed this scene with their own eyes. Tens of thousands of undead were swallowed by the broken ice. The seawater and broken ice rolled up and down, and then nothing was left. How could this be? Sok was at a loss. Didn't the plan say that the eternal night would last for 3 days? He had imagined all kinds of scenarios in his mind, including the failure of the sneak attack or the invasion of the Bugas, but there was no such scenario. He could not figure out why the people of Madara would trap themselves and drag the White Legion down with them. Suddenly, he felt a strong sense of warning in his heart. He subconsciously raised his head, and with the help of the rising dawn, he was horrified to find that the direction of Fathom Harbor was empty. There was no sign of a fleet in the sky at all. He was fooled. Sok's heart was cold. Retreat. There was only one thought in his mind at this moment. He could not help but roar at all the undead in Fort Seacliff. Retreat. But unfortunately it was still a little too late. On the sea cliff, Sydney's platinum eyes reflected the brilliance of the morning sun, as if a raging flame was burning. The grand spell of descent, the holy judgment of the kings. Chapter 1045. The icy wind blew the ice dust on the surface of the frozen sea, stirring up a thin layer of fog like waves. In the direction of Wuxia Bay, there was a small group of people who were slowly advancing against the icy wind. "It's about time," Brando suddenly said after a while. "It's about time?" Yuta looked at him in confusion. "We can enter the city now," Brando replied. Everyone looked at each other. Although the main force of the White Legion had left Wuxia, it was impossible for there to be no guards stationed in the city. Other things aside, they had not seen the White Legion's Drake Knight regiment on their way here. Everyone knew that their lord had come here for a reason, but they could not guess what he was thinking. It was obviously unrealistic to rely on such a small number of people to ambush Wuxia. Even if they used a decapitation tactic, it was also impossible. After all, the White Legion was one of the 4 most elite legions in the Empire. If they only had this much ability, it was obviously not enough to convince them. However, Mare and Yuta did not question Brando's decision. Only Teru asked casually, "My lord, just us?" After a short period of interaction, Brando was already used to this student from the Shire. Hence, he was not surprised by his question. He turned around and smiled mysteriously at him. "You'll know later." "Later?" Teru was puzzled. "Wait, my lord. You know that I'm not afraid of death, but you're making me curious. What are we going to do?" Yuta frowned. "Enough," she stopped him. "Just listen to my lord's orders. You talk too much nonsense." "It's okay," Brando said as he turned around and continued walking forward. His voice came from the front along with the cold wind. "Of course you have to know your target. And of course we're going to occupy Wuxia." "Occupy?" Mare raised his eyebrows. "Oh, Wuxia." Teru's jaw dropped. "My lord, I didn't hear wrong, did I? With just the few of us?" "I've already answered your question, haven't I?" Brando replied with a smile. All right." Teru shrugged. "But my lord, you have to tell us how to do it, right? Very simple. Who does Wuxia belong to?" "The mayor of Wuxia is Count Brill, but the one who can make the decision now is probably the commander of the White Legion stationed in the city, Duke Ambuner," Mare immediately replied. "That's why we need to convince Duke Ambuner to give us Wuxia City," Brando replied without turning his head. "Don't joke around, my lord. There is no doubt that this is impossible." Teru shook his head disapprovingly, obviously treating Brendel's words as a joke that wasn't that funny. "No, I'm not joking. Why is this impossible?" "Teru, didn't your teacher teach you that there's nothing impossible in this world?" Brendel grinned at Teru's astonished face and winked at him. "Teru, didn't your teacher teach you that nothing is impossible in this world?" Hearing these words, everyone couldn't help but stop and look at each other. Mir furrowed his brows. He didn't even notice that his hood was blown up by the cold wind, and his long hair was fluttering wildly in the wind. The commander of the Drake Knight Legion, Hudson, stood by the turquoise river and looked at the dark city on the west bank. There were faint lights in the darkness, and the tall towers and temples outlined the outline of the city. Everything was peaceful and quiet, as if the war at Fathom Port had nothing to do with it. But Hudson knew that other than his Drake Knight Legion, only Baron Luke and Prince's troops were stationed in the city of the White Legion. Their defense was weaker than a piece of paper, and they were in danger of being ambushed at any time. Although most people, including Duke Ambuner, did not believe that the eldest prince had the ability to attack Wuxia City, this did not stop Hudson from worrying. His worries were groundless, but he still could not fall asleep. In the middle of the night, he put on his clothes and came to the turquoise river, hoping that the cold wind would clear his mind and clear his doubts. Finally, the darkness of the night made him feel a little more at ease. He hoped that the night would bring them good luck, just as the others wished. But suddenly, he felt that the night had faded a little. This illusion startled him, and he quickly rubbed his eyes, only to find that it was not his perception that was wrong. A few hundred meters away, the Iron Wolf Bridge that crossed the turquoise river was only a silhouette in the darkness, but now the outline of the bridge was faintly outlined, and the white rocks that formed the bridge were clearly visible. The light was still gradually getting brighter, but Hudson was terrified. He looked up with some difficulty and saw a line of golden light rising from the horizon. This golden light was like a sharp sword, piercing his heart. Outside of Ahin, Half of the sky had turned from black to pale white. Then a beautiful pink appeared beneath the clouds, as if the sublime inland sea had been set ablaze. It was incomparably dazzling. This scene was not rare. For the past hundreds of years, Ovchin had to experience it almost every day. This was the sunrise, the arrival of the day. The morning light was not shifted by anyone's will. It broke through the heavy darkness and sprinkled on the earth, enveloping everything in warmth. Ovchin's shadow was rapidly retreating, as if it had been defeated, and in an instant, it had retreated to the west of the turquoise river. In the face of this scene, Hudson did not feel the slightest warmth. He only felt a chill in his heart. The undead of Madara had promised that the sun would set in 3 days, but now it was not even half a day. "Captain, something big has happened." Several knights hurriedly ran over from the direction of the Dragon Knights' camp. "What are you panicking for?" "I'm not blind." Hudson frowned and looked back, his heart full of anger. He did not know if it was because of the betrayal of the undead, or because of the panic of his men, but he gritted his teeth and scolded. "What are you waiting for? Go and prepare." His words were stuck in his throat. In the sky above Ovchin, a bright circle of light appeared. The whole sky was buzzing, as if heralding the arrival of something. Everyone in the city stopped what they were doing. Hudson and his knight looked up instinctively. Some citizens ran out of their homes to witness this strange scene. Then countless circles of light appeared in the sky. Mast after mast extended from the circle of light, then the bow of the ship, then half of the ship, and finally the entire ship sailed out of the circle of light. In the sky above Ovchin, countless warships appeared in an instant. It was as if the city had just been bathed in the sun, and then the sky suddenly darkened. At that moment, the people of Ovchin understood what it meant to blot out the sun. Countless silver sails flapped in the wind like the sea. For a moment, the entire sky above Ovchin seemed to be filled with this sound. Hudson was petrified, and so were his knight subordinates. Of course, they knew where these silver warships came from, but no one dared to act rashly. In order to ambush this fleet, all the air forces of the White Legion had been sent to the front line by Duke Ambuner, but their prey had appeared in Ovchin, which was dozens of miles away from the front line. Martha above, Hudson screamed in his heart. What exactly went wrong? At this moment there were at most a few Griffin Knight scouts in the city, but there were only a few of them. How could they fight against this fleet? Unless they were crazy. As for the others, were they going to let their infantry and cavalry fight against the fleet and kill the enemy with their mines? Should they let the Griffin squadron back? It was too late. Hudson's mind was blank. Trenthium's fleet didn't launch an attack at the first moment. In Kongwei Fortress, Duke Ambuner stood up with a serious expression and looked at the uninvited guest in front of him. "Who are you?" Count Brill, who was destroying documents, also stopped what he was doing and looked up at the stranger who pushed the door open. His expression changed. "Who let you in? Where are the guards?" Duke Ambuner reached out to stop his old friend. "You must be the grandson of Darius, Count Tonagel, Mr. Brando," the Duke said calmly. "What brings you here?" The one who pushed the door open was Brando, followed by Yuta, Mare and Teru. Other than himself, the others looked as if they were facing a great enemy. Behind them, several guards dressed in the White Army's battle robes were lying on the ground in a disorderly manner. They had long lost consciousness. Brendel was not surprised by Ambunel's question, but he was a little surprised that Ambunel was so familiar with him. It seemed that his grandfather was quite influential in the Empire. Not only Veronica, but even this duke, who was known as the Ghost Wolf on the battlefield of the Holy War, was able to recognize Brendel's identity at once. Compared to his identity as the Count of Tonagel, the people of Cruz were more sensitive to his identity as the descendant of Darius. He thought that the Empire did not take him seriously. At most, it was because of the intervention of the Bugas that they paid so much attention to the White Legion, but it seemed that he had underestimated his influence. He knew that the White Legion was directly loyal to the Silver Queen. Since Duke Ambuner could recognize his identity, it meant that the Silver Queen, Constance, should also know of his existence. For a moment, Brando felt a little flattered. He thought for a moment, then waved his hand to signal Mare behind him to close the door, and then smiled at the two people in the room. "Duke, I think it's time for us to sit down and have a good talk." Ovachin's defense was weak. Although there were some masters in Fort Kongwei, they were still some distance away from him. In fact, in the entire White Legion except for Ambuner, who was close to the supreme class, he did not have to worry about the others. Besides, he had the dimensional elements. In fact, he did not alert anyone when he entered the room, except for Count Brill and Duke Ambuner. Duke Ambuner's face was as calm as water. He stretched out his hand, and the floating skeletal staff flew into his hand. He looked at Brando and asked, "What do you want to talk about?" "Surrender." "Surrender?" Duke Ambuner was surprised. "Who surrendered to whom? Are you representing the eldest son to me?" Brando was not angry. He replied, "Duke, you know what I mean." Duke Ambuner did not speak. He was standing at a position where he could see the scene in Ovchin through the stone window. A moment ago, the cold wind howled in the harbor, and the scene of the night had disappeared. The bright sun shrouded the entire harbor, and the newly thought dock was a mess. A little further away, the sky was filled with silver clouds. That was the Tanajul fleet. The constant buzzing in the sky seemed to remind him of the final result of the battle. Although Her Majesty the Queen and the undead of Madara seemed to work together seamlessly, the result was that the White Legion had fallen into a huge trap. He still did not understand what the problem was. The Tanajul fleet did not attack. But once the Erowin people or the Buga people started to attack, Ovchin would change hands in an instant, and even fall into a sea of fire. There were still troops of the White Legion in the city, but whether it was the Earth Dragon Knight Regiment, Baron Luke and Sir Prince's troops, they could not go up to the sky to fight with the floating fleet. The other party had not attacked yet because the other party had given him an ultimatum. Duke Ambuner knew that this ultimatum had been given a few seconds ago by the unbelievably young count in front of him. What was left was his choice. The descendant of the marshal is better than I thought. He raised the skeletal staff in his hand. But it's impossible for me to surrender. As soon as he finished speaking, a white light pierced towards Brando. Frost Wolf, the emblem of the Telek family. They were the most terrifying beasts of winter in the north of Britain. They were ruthless, and they breathed the breath of winter. The mountain people believed that the winter wolves were the spokesmen of winter. Their appearance meant the arrival of winter, and when winter came, everything would be frozen, and it would be the season where all life would fall into stagnation and eternal sleep. In the legends that circulated in the countryside, when the gods passed away in the last era, there would be an endless winter. Spring would not return, and after that would be the end of the world. Endless winter. This was Duke Ambuner's element. In an instant the temperature in the room dropped. Brando, who bore the brunt of it, shook his head as if he had expected this. It was obvious that the spirit wolf's bad temper was not an undeserved reputation. Chapter 1046. As soon as Duke Ambuner moved, Brando reacted. Halrangaya was already out of its scabbard, and the dark blade blocked the path of the winter wolf's bite. At the same time, the space-time elements were densely packed, and the lines of law were so dense that they formed a mercury wall. This was the manifestation of the power of superior elemental power. The strength of the elements surprised Duke Ambuner. This was the manifestation of the highest level of elemental power. In the long history of Wonde, countless heroes were like stars in the sky, and those who could comprehend such a law were all the brightest stars in the sky. He seemed to have understood something, but this hesitation was not enough to make an old soldier who had experienced a tragic war give up his sword and surrender. He might have seen failure, and this failure was the same as the premonition of his own death on the battlefield of the Second Holy War decades ago. There were no immortal soldiers in this world, but there were no soldiers who would surrender with their swords. Although Brando had expected the stubbornness and strength of this ghost wolf, he did not expect that he had underestimated his opponent. The dense layers of space-time elements deflected most of the energy of Duke Ambuner's attack into a distorted space, but the remaining small part still broke through the heavy defense and hit the spine of Halrangaya. A terrible force came from Halrangaya, and before he could react, he saw the scenery in front of him blurring, and his back hit the wall heavily. "My lord!" He vaguely heard the screams of Yuta, Mare, and the others, and the fierce momentum in front of him attacked again. The breath of ice spread along the thick carpet on the floor as if it had a life of its own, leaving a frozen forest in its wake. In the blink of an eye, it was right in front of him. This power was terrifying. The gap between the peak of the law and the elemental enlightenment was greater than he had expected. In the game, because of the level cap in each version, players rarely had the opportunity to experience such a gap between two realms. But now Brando felt like he was fighting a world boss alone. He originally thought that after experiencing the baptism of the Black Knight White, he was prepared for the power above the realm, but this preparation proved to be insufficient. Duke Ambuner was also half a step into the Lamita realm, and he was also a veteran of the Holy War. He had survived a hellish slaughter, and his determination was unmatched by anyone else. Brando couldn't think of anything else. He immediately activated Frenzy, and a surge of energy surged through his body, the killing intent in his heart soared, and he raised his sword to block Duke Ambuner's Winter Wolf's bite. This time he could clearly feel that the opponent's strength had weakened a lot, but it was actually an illusion caused by the sudden increase in his own strength. Brando had used the Berserk ability many times, so naturally, he would not make a mistake. With Duke Ambuner's strength, he crashed through the wall with a bang, and in a cloud of dust, he had already arrived outside Kongwei Fortress. Duke Ambuner did not give up on attacking, and at the same time he chased after him, preparing to use the Winter Wolf's bite for the third time. Kongwei Fortress was built on the banks of the Turquoise River, and Brill's study happened to be on the side of the river. At this time, the two sides were actually fighting on the surface of the river. Duke Ambuner raised the skeletal staff in his hand and was about to attack, but at this moment, an unexpected scene happened. Suddenly, a black light flashed in his hand, and the treasure of darkness suddenly shrank and exploded from the middle. A violent surge of dark energy surged, and the Duke was caught off guard by the explosion. A black light flashed on the surface of the river, and the shock wave of the explosion instantly swept in all directions, pressing a hemispherical depression on the surface of the river. After the shock wave passed, the surface of the water exploded. It was drizzling, and the rain stained the sky with dust before turning into mud and falling down. Duke Ambuner was embarrassed by the explosion, and the skeletal staff in his hand had long been shattered. Before he could figure out what happened, a figure flashed in the rain in front of him, and he only felt a chill on his neck. He felt the chill of the Howran Gaia's blade. He was slightly startled, opened his eyes, and found that Brando had used the explosion as an opportunity to get close to him and put the sword on his neck. The opponent had timed it very well, as if he was not affected by the explosion at all. It was as if he had expected it. Otherwise, with his ability, he would have been able to react in time. He was silent for a while, looked down at the skeletal staff in his hand, and let it fall into the water of the Turquoise River. He looked up and said, "It seems that the army of the dead is done for. This is as you expected. The treasure of the dead that Madara went through so much trouble to find is so weak in your hands. Not only that, you even used it to lure me into action, and I was so stupid that I fell for it." Brando smiled, thinking that it was all a fluke. The White Legion's plan was meticulous. If he had not bumped into the Black Knight White, and learned the whole plan from him, and obtained the fragments of order, even if he had known in advance that the Silver Queen was working with the skeletons of Madara, it would have been difficult to defend Fathom Port. But he had bumped into them. Of course, this was also because he was sensitive enough. Once the offensive and defensive positions were switched, it was Duke Ambuner's turn to be unaware. The Ghost Wolves were not undeserving of their reputation, and the strength of the White Legion was not to be underestimated. It was just that he did not give them any chance, and the battle was declared over before it even started. "Your Grace," Brando said, "you should understand that stubborn resistance will not change anything." Duke Ambuner was silent. In fact, the moment he chased out of Kongwei Fortress, he had already felt that he was locked on by several sharp senses. These senses came from the fleet in the sky, and he was very familiar with one of them. It belonged to an old friend of Cruz's. When he recognized this sense, he knew that he had no chance. Among the 4 commanders of the Empire, Veronica, who had returned from the loop of trade winds, was the strongest. Even she was no match for that person, let alone Duke Ambuner. With that person around, Duke Ambuner knew that he had no chance of winning from the beginning, regardless of whether Brando had schemed against him or not. He looked up at one of the warships floating in the sky and said calmly, "Please give me some face." Your Grace, why do you insist on this? Duke Ambuner glanced at Brando. In the history of the Empire, there has never been a precedent of an entire White Legion surrendering. I dare not be the first to do so. After I die, they will naturally fight to the last moment. Every member of the White Legion will not disgrace their honor. No one will disgrace the honor of the White Legion. I am not asking you to surrender to the eldest son of the Emperor. What do you mean? Duke Ambuner was stunned. Since you have admitted defeat, I will naturally let you leave this place, Brando replied in a casual tone. What? Are you serious? I have no benefit in lying to you, Your Grace. Duke Ambuner frowned deeply. This sounded like the practice of the ancient nobles. At that time, the nobles saw war as a means to win glory. The victors would often let the losers leave with dignity. Except for the warriors who died on the battlefield, the unarmed people would never be hurt. The war of that era had nothing to do with plunder or profit. It was more like a righteous challenge. But since the sacred oath gradually lost its effect, even the internal strife between countries became more and more unscrupulous. But he did not understand why Brando did this. Can you guarantee that my men will not be hurt, and that they can leave East Metz intact? He asked with a frown. I can't guarantee that they will be able to leave East Metz in one piece, but I can guarantee that anyone who wants to leave this place will be able to do so without any hindrance. However, I request that they do not stay in the Metz region for long. They should head to the imperial capital within the time I set. As for whether they want to meet up with Her Majesty's army or have other plans, I will not interfere. Brendel thought for a moment and spoke his mind. At this time he saw Yuta Mare and the others coming out of the hole in Kongwei Fortress. He immediately signaled them with his eyes, indicating that they did not need to come over. After Yuta and the others noticed the situation outside, they were obviously relieved. They also heard what Brando said before, but the three of them, including Mare, did not believe that Brando could really persuade Duke Ambuner. Although he did say so at the beginning, it was beyond their imagination to make an entire frontline legion of the Empire surrender. Even if the White Legion were to be wiped out, it would be better than bowing down to Erewhon. The impact of the latter would be devastating, and the people of the Empire would never allow such a thing to happen. But when they saw Brando's confident look, they could not help but have some doubts. But I asked that the White Legion must give up resistance on the spot and hand over their weapons, and I asked to take over Ovchin City. Before sending you all away, I need to temporarily hold you captive for a period of time to prevent any trouble. These requirements are reasonable, and I believe Your Grace can understand. Surrender? Duke Ambuner frowned. How can I believe that you will keep your promise? You may not believe my promise, Your Grace, Brando replied. But I can give you a royal promise. A royal promise? Prince Haruz is also a member of the diplomatic team to the Empire this time. If he makes a promise to you, Your Grace should not doubt it anymore. As everyone knows, His Royal Highness will become the King of Erewhon in the future, so this will in fact be a promise from a king, Brando replied. If that's the case, I think I can accept it. Duke Ambuner nodded. Brando took out a communication crystal from his arms. He activated the crystal, and the image of several white lion guards immediately appeared on the crystal. As soon as the soldiers saw him, they immediately shouted excitedly, "My lord, you came at the right time." After the undead army was wiped out, the White Legion's counterattack was more fierce than expected. Thanks to Her Royal Highness' morale at the front line, they might have already attacked the port. What? Her Royal Highness? Brando was shocked. Why is Her Royal Highness at the front line? Yes, Your Grace, Her Royal Highness is here. Do you want to talk to her? Brendel looked at the crystal in his hand in bewilderment, watching as the image on the crystal changed into Princess Graphine's appearance. But he immediately noticed that this Princess Graphine didn't look quite right. First of all, she wasn't as determined as the eldest princess. Instead, she was a little evasive. At least the eldest princess would never act like a shy little girl in front of him with a blushing face. And he always felt that he had seen this face somewhere before. There was always some familiar impression in his mind. Until the princess finally opened her mouth shyly. "Teacher, Brendel sucked in a cold breath. "What are you doing?" He immediately understood who this Her Royal Highness was and could not help but ask. Aye. Haruz looked like he was about to cry. "Teacher, I'm wrong." Brando immediately shut his mouth. He knew that now was not the time to ask what the little prince was doing. The most important task now was to gain Duke Ambunal's trust. The White Legion had launched an attack on Fathom Harbor without Duke Ambunal's command. Of course, he knew how weak the defenses in the harbor were. At this time he could not delay any longer. Thinking of this, he turned to look at Duke Ambunal. At this moment, Duke Ambunal heard the conversation between the two, and his heart sank. He did not expect that Fathom Harbor had not been breached at this time. He could not help but feel even more pessimistic about the White Legion's situation. He nodded and said, "If it's Her Royal Highness, I have no objections." As everyone knew at this time in Erewhon, Haruz's sister was the one who had a say. Although the little prince claimed to be the future king, no one could say for sure what would happen in the future. Duke Ambunal obviously did not recognize that the other side of the crystal was an impostor. Brando immediately gave Haruz a look, indicating that he should not be so flustered. He then told the latter about the current situation. Although Haruz was not confident enough, he was not stupid. He immediately made a promise to Duke Ambunal in the name of the Erewhon royal family that he would never go back on his words. After receiving the promise, Duke Ambunal's expression was obviously a lot more lonely. "I want to know," he said, "how long will my men be prisoners, and when does my lord plan to arrange for them to leave Metz?" "Don't worry, my lord, we will not make a fuss about this," Brando comforted him. "I need a few days to take over Ovchin, but at the latest, I will arrange for the White Legion to leave in a week." Duke Ambunal was stunned for a moment before he nodded silently. Brendel heaved a sigh of relief when he saw him setting an example. At this moment, Yuta and the others in Kongwei Fortress were already stunned. Chapter 1047. In Fathom Harbor, the main city wall was in a mess. Many parts of the wall had collapsed due to magic, and the rubble was scattered all over the ground. Amidst the smoke and dust, the Imperial soldiers in red and white battle robes stepped on the collapsed wall and swarmed in. On top of the well-preserved city wall, the troops in the same battle robes were gradually gaining the upper hand. Numerous siege ladders were hung on the battlements, and more red and white robes were gradually converging on the city wall through these ladders. In contrast, the green robes that represented the garrison of Fathom Harbor were losing ground. In fact, in most areas, the battle had come to an end and turned into street fighting. The change in the situation seemed to have happened just a moment ago. Sydney summoned the Angel of Wrath, Aroma, and destroyed all the undead in the valley in one fell swoop. After that, the Coast Guards launched a counterattack and reoccupied Fort Seacliff. However, the good times did not last long. The White Legion then arrived at the battlefield and launched a strong attack. On the Imperial side, the great wizard Tony from Sienian led a group of sorcerers to flatten Fort Seacliff at all costs and left a bottomless pit hundreds of square meters in size. The Coast Guards suffered heavy losses in this attack, and due to Brando's prior orders, the Shire did not allow Tonagel's sorcerers to launch a counterattack. In fact, a counterattack would have been useless as the difference in strength between the two sides was obvious. The White Legion then launched an attack on Fathom Harbor. Although the Coast Guards, whose morale was boosted by their previous victory, resisted desperately, the huge difference in strength determined the outcome from the very beginning. The sorcerers of the Empire quickly destroyed the main city wall of Fathom Harbor, and the scene that happened just now happened. Delphian moved the position to the small monastery under the protection of the crowd. She listened to the sound of fighting on the front line and quickly realized that the Coast Guards were still unable to gain a foothold. The Empire had deployed garrison infantry to the front of the battlefield. These phalanxes of infantry advanced along every street in a formation. Looking at it, one could see a moving wall made of floating square shields. Behind the square shields, one could vaguely see the heavily armored infantry with only a pair of eyes exposed under the metal helmet. They held spears that were a few meters long and extended the spears from the gaps between the shields. It was as if a forest of spears had risen, and the densely packed spear tips were shining with cold light. The archers of the Coast Guards were helpless against these metal fortresses. Occasionally, the sharpshooters in the army could shoot their arrows into the gaps of the shields or into the eyes. However, when the infantrymen at the front fell, the heavy armored infantrymen at the back would immediately fill in the gaps in the square formation. The few casualties seemed like a stone thrown into the sea, not causing any waves. Although the advance of the garrison infantry was neither too fast nor too slow, it made them feel hopeless. Forced by the situation, the Coast Guards on the western side of Fathom Harbor launched a short-range counterattack. However, the result of the counterattack was very unfavorable. The entire battle went on like a hot knife through butter. In less than a quarter of an hour, almost 1/10 of the entire squadron was left alive. Moreover, there were very few injured soldiers. Most of them had turned into cold corpses lying on both sides of the street. Only then did everyone understand why the White Legion's garrison infantry was called the Dragon Spear Formation in the Second Holy War. It was not an undeserved reputation. On the rooftops, there were also Flame Hawk archers of the White Legion, who wore red trimmings and white cloaks. These rangers were actually from the Red Legion. However, in the Year of the Hare, the Silver Queen intended to cultivate similar types of soldiers in the other legions. Therefore, she had transferred a large group of Flame Hawk archers from the Red Legion to the other 3 legions. However, the plan did not go well because most of the Flame Hawk archers were actually rangers. They came from the mountainous areas of Floating Cloud Hill, Anslova, Anzaruta, and Anzalin. The other 3 legions mainly came from Metz, Mihodafen, Ludwig, and farmers or mountain people in the countryside of Bankel and Cloak Bay. The difference in talent and understanding of archery between the two was too big. Although many outstanding archers were trained in the end, they were still far from the original expectations. However, after the plan was put on hold, the Silver Queen did not return the transferred Flame Hawk archers to the Red Legion. Instead, she let them stay in the other 3 legions as a special organization. These Flame Hawk archers had different experiences. Among them, the White Legion's Flame Hawk archers had even fought against the Fanzin's Silver Flag Knight in the Alcala area during the Year of the Pillar. Therefore, there was a falcon tail feather on the left chest of their cloaks, as a symbol to distinguish them from other Flame Hawk archers. Within the White Legion, these Flame Hawk archers were usually called falconers. These falconers carefully crouched on the roofs and moved forward in groups of 2 or 3. Although there were not many of them, they posed a great threat to the Coast Guards. In the past, whenever a captain, knight commander, or grand knight of the Coast Guards appeared, they would be attacked by unpredictable arrows. The accuracy of these arrows was so high that it almost caused the lower command of the Coast Guards to collapse. As for the Coast Guards and White Lion Guards who were entrenched in temporary work, the falconers used fire arrows and refraction shots to clear them out one by one. This was their specialty. The fire arrows of the Flame Hawk archers could cause an explosion similar to the fireball spell, and the refraction shots could be used to attack enemies who were hiding in buildings. In front of them, there was almost no fortress that could be considered solid. If the garrison infantry was like a simple, unadorned heavy sword that could easily break through the enemy's defense, then the Flame Hawk archers were like dexterous boning knives. The 2 sharp knives cooperated with each other and were unstoppable in the street battle. The Coast Guards quickly lost the first and second barricades, and Erwin's White Lion Guards also encountered trouble in the first battle. Although they succeeded in stopping the White Legion's advance towards the Fossa Grande Cathedral, they also suffered the heaviest casualties since the start of the war. On Delphian's map, Fathom Harbor was almost one of 3 places gone in an instant. Red and white flags representing the Empire were planted in all the important streets. The aggressive combat power of the Empire made everyone present fall into silence. Even the nobles of the Empire, everyone in the Empire might have heard about the pride of the Empire from the moment they were born. The legends of the 4 legendary legions passed down from the era of the War of the Holy Saints: the Burnett Legion, the Anderson Legion, the Oderfeist Legion, and the Donut Legion. It was these 4 legions that gradually evolved into the Green, White, Red, and Black Legions. However, if one did not truly stand on the opposite side and become their opponent, one would not understand how powerful they were. The glory of the Empire, the majesty of the Empire, and the power of the Empire were not empty words. What should we do? Baron Ludwig's wrinkled face was very pale. Should we retreat to Fathom Fortress? No, Count Alcorn shook his head. If we retreat now, it will cause a collapse in morale, and it's not time yet. But if we don't retreat, when that old wolf's men come again, we won't be able to hold on. Count Alcorn smiled bitterly. I didn't expect that old man to be so capable. The others looked at the Prime Minister's daughter in the wheelchair, as if they wanted to see if she had any solutions. However, Delphine's face was also solemn. She just nodded and agreed with the former's opinion. The attack was really suffocating. Their previous judgment was too optimistic. The enemy had not sent in the Griffin Knight and the Silver Pegasus Knight, otherwise, they would not be able to hold on until noon. In fact, even now the entire port's defense line could collapse at any time. The Coast Guards were like a string stretched to its limit. No one knew when it would suddenly snap. It should be known that the White Legion was one of the 4 great legions of the Empire that was better at defense and field warfare. The garrison infantry that they were proud of was actually a powerful defensive infantry. The Earth Dragon Knights, on the other hand, could not be used in sieges at all. Did the Empire stop attacking the Forza Holy Cathedral? She suddenly asked. Yes. The noble who brought the news immediately answered. However, he was a little uncomfortable with Delphian calling the White Legion the Empire. In fact, most of the people present still saw this war as a civil war. He sorted out his emotions and replied in a somewhat incredulous tone. It's true, Miss Delphian. I really don't know how those Erewhon people did it. They seem to have repelled the Legion's attack from the front. The White Legion was also puzzled by the strength of the enemy in front of them. Erewhon's troops were constantly shouting like a tsunami. It was as if they had gone crazy. On the other side of the street, the knight captains of the White Legion looked at each other. They had already organized 3 attacks before this, but each time they were mercilessly repelled. The death ratio of Erewhon's troops to theirs was almost 3-1, but the enemy continued to advance without fear or death. The street was a mess. Both sides were so busy fighting that they didn't even have time to retrieve the corpses. Blood dyed the street red. Every stone on the street seemed to be soaked in blood, reflecting a strange light. The soldiers below had already named the street in front of them as Blood Street. However, Erewhon's troops were still stubbornly guarding a few key streets, unwilling to take a step back. It was as if the Legion would not be able to advance even an inch if they did not kill all of them. These low-ranking officers of the White Legion had experienced countless battles, but they had never fought such a fierce battle. The heavy infantry on the front line had almost lost a few men. In fact, at least 3 squads had been completely crippled and retreated from the front line. The falconers on the roof had also encountered opponents, and their situation was even worse. The opponents they encountered were much stronger than Erewhon's infantry. It was a group of rangers, mostly made up of sharp-eared elven soldiers. Not only did the enemy have amazing shooting skills, but their ability to hide their whereabouts was also terrifying. When the falconers first discovered them, they were still unaware of the fact that the enemy was close to 30 feet away from them. In the end, they were shot intensively from a distance that was almost a roof away, causing the entire team to be almost wiped out. The White Legion soldiers at the back wanted to chase after them, but the elven archers had already spread out their cloaks and jumped to other rooftops far away. They then turned back and sniped at them for a while. In the end, the heavy infantry at the front line suffered heavy losses, and several knight captains died. Almost half of the White Legion's casualties were attributed to the elven archers. Later, the White Legion commander had no choice but to mobilize the nearby falconer squadrons in this direction, which finally relieved some of the pressure. However, it only relieved some of the pressure. Although the falconers that had gathered far outnumbered the elven archers, they were still being suppressed. After being ambushed countless times, the Red Legion archers finally realized that the enemy could actually hide. The falconers on the rooftops were suppressed to the point that they did not dare to show their heads. At this point, the battle had already reached a stalemate. No matter how fearless the White Legion was, it was impossible for them to rashly advance without any cover. Not to mention that Erewhon's people on the opposite side were ready to fight to the death. Even if they were to show their reckless momentum, they might not be able to break through in a short period of time. Moreover, among the heavy infantry on the front line, there were not that many knight commanders who could snipe the enemy's elven archers. The enemy should be Erewhon's White Lion Legion. After a moment of silence, a knight finally could not help but speak. Their fighting spirit is a little beyond my expectations. I'm now very curious how Anzaruda's irregular army gained the upper hand in the battle with these guys on the highlands. No, that's not a pure White Lion Legion. They have white lion shawls on their shoulders, which is obviously different from the other white lions. Perhaps it's a special organization similar to our falconers. Did you notice that their attire is very similar to the white lion infantry recorded in history? But no matter what, the truly powerful ones are the elven archers, another knight said with a frown. Where did they come from? We have never heard of such a ranger unit in Wound. Their abilities are too unique. It's impossible for them to be unknown. It's obvious that urban warfare is not their main battlefield. This ranger unit is the true king of jungle warfare. Could it be the wind elves? No, it's the tree elves. But the tree elves' forest archers are not like this. Their performance in urban warfare is far worse than this ranger unit. Well, no matter who they are, at least I can be sure that this ranger unit will be famous after today. The first knight looked at his companions who were at a loss of what to do and frowned. He waved his hand and said, "You've gone off topic. What we need to discuss now is what should we do next? Our superiors have asked us to cooperate with the attack from the south and take down the Fossa Sanctum within an hour. But these Erewhon people seem to have gone crazy. The others won't listen to our explanation. They will only laugh at us for not being able to deal with a group of country bumpkins. This problem is not easy to solve. If these people are considered country bumpkins, then I can't help but doubt our combat power. You should indeed review your performance." At this time a dignified voice interrupted. All the knights present couldn't help but tremble when they heard this voice. They turned around and respectfully saluted the person who interrupted. "Sir." The person who walked into the circle was the commander of this unit, Sir Lucius. He looked at his subordinates with a serious face and replied, "There's no need to discuss. The orders have been given." "What? The superiors are willing to provide us with air support, my lord?" "No," Sir Lucius replied simply. "This is an order from Duke Ambuner. He ordered us to stop the attack immediately and return to the Golden Needle Valley to await further orders." "What? Why? Taking down Farton Port is right in front of us?" "There's no why. The attack has been blocked. Do you see the Buga fleet? This is an order. Executed immediately." "Yes." The knight was silent for a moment, but they still nodded. Chapter 1048. The sunlight pouring down on the square of the temple was so bright that it was a little dazzling. The tip of the spear shone with the light of the snow. Haruz stood on the steps of the Fossa Sanctum with a long sword in his hand, covered in blood. He gritted his teeth and stood firm. The summer wind blew the flag on the top of the basilica. The golden flame sacred emblem shone brightly, and the snow-like petals of the silver tree fluttered down. The Empire's army was rushing into the square, and the White Lion Guard's defense circle was shrinking. But he could not retreat. "Haruz, stand up and do it again." She put her cold hand on his forehead and looked into his eyes. "You are the only man of House Covardo. You have no other choice. You have to take up your responsibility and responsibility," she said slowly. "You are the only man of House Covardo. You have no other choice. You have to take up your responsibility. You are the king, and your blood should flow for House Covardo, for the royal family, and for your people. The so-called king is the one who bleeds first." Amidst the chaotic battle cries, a White Lion Guard's anxious shout seemed to come from the distant horizon into his thoughts. "Your Highness, please retreat to the back. We can't defend this place anymore." The hairband that bound her hair had been broken at some point, and her long silver hair fluttered in the wind. Her hair brushed past her blood-stained face, and a smile bloomed on her face that was as firm and gentle as a princess's. Haruz looked down at the bloody knight and smiled. "I can't retreat, as we will win soon. I believe in my teacher. He will do it." But the sword was pointed forward, and the tip of the sword shone under the sunlight. Haruz slowly leveled the sword, and his eyes formed a straight line. His slightly childish face had an almost sacred solemnity. "Yes, today I am Princess Forza, and today I will lead you to victory. Listen up, the Kurlutzians haven't had time to spread out. Take advantage of the fact that they haven't settled down and attacked their left wing with me." "Your Highness, you can't risk it." "Why not?" Haruz looked back and replied, pressing a hand to his chest. "This is the blood of the royal family which flows for the throne. One day, the flower of the royal family will wither, but the stars of the ancient kings will rise and shine on Erewhon for eternity." These were the claws and fangs of a white lion. This was the wings of the white lion, the glory of the white lion. This was the soul of the white lion, the pride of the white lion. The tension on the faces of the young knights turned into holiness. In their hearts there was a melody from the ancient times. It was sorrowful and majestic but also impassioned. This was the belief that Brando and the late King Eric passed on to them. It was as if they had passed through a distant time and space, allowing people to see the truth and belief behind everything. Come with me, my knight. I am with you, and I will fight by your side. Your Highness, you are with us. We will fight side by side. The knight's reply was deep and majestic. On the battlefield, an epic poem was being composed. Erwin's army suddenly moved and launched a fierce attack. On the square, countless knights of the White Lion Guards cheered like mountains and waves. They praised and shouted, "Long live the White Lion! Long live the princess! Long live Erwin!" and launched a deadly attack on the Imperial infantry. They were so excited yet so indifferent. They were so unafraid of death, as if what they were about to face was not death, but supreme glory. Cruz's army was stunned. They found that their enemies' eyes were flashing with madness. They rushed into the forest of spears, rushed between the rows of shield walls, and let the spears pierce their bodies, but still attacked the Imperial army behind the shield walls. The Imperial army's front line was shaken. By the time they reacted, the White Lion Guards had already created a huge hole in their formation. When the commander of the White Legion saw this scene, he was heartbroken. Before they could spread out, the left wing's weakness was caught by the enemy. However, he did not expect Erwin's army to be so decisive. They seized this only chance from the desperate situation with their lives. This chance was about to ruin everything. The Coast Guards were also stunned. They witnessed a desperate counterattack. The retreating side was a famous legend, the Anderson Legion, the Pale Wolf of the Plains, the White of the Empire. Erwin's army was creating a miracle, and this miracle would spread across the continent in the blink of an eye. The Empire was defeated in front of Erwin's army. After a moment of hesitation, all the Coast Guards howled and joined the counterattack. They only knew one thing. After today, both sides involved in this battle would become famous. It would witness the rise of a legion. And at this moment the glory belonged to Erwin. It was snowing heavily, and the accumulated snow was very thick. He staggered, and sweat seemed to have blurred his vision. He felt as if a nail had pierced into his lungs, and there was a burning pain. His hair stuck to his cheeks, and his vision was so heavy that it seemed like he would fall asleep at any time. But he still held his sword tightly in his trembling hand. Clang! A cold light flashed, and the sword in his hand flew out. It spun and fell into the snow, splashing a handful of snowflakes. Before he could react, a strong force came from his chest. His vision blurred, and he was lifted off the ground and landed heavily on the snow. The cold melted snow flowed down from his forehead, along his nose, and to the tip of his chin. His clothes were already wet, and the cold penetrated his heart. "Stand up," a cold voice with a hint of disappointment ordered. "One more time." For some reason, tears suddenly flowed out of his eyes. "Don't cry, Haruz." Haruz looked up with teary eyes and saw the person standing in front of him. His sister's tall and straight figure, wearing a thin armor suit and holding a long sword, stood in the heavy snow. This is... He subconsciously turned his head around. Under the claws and teeth of the ancient charred oak tree stood a tall figure. He wore a wide and thick cloak. Behind the flying snow, he nodded his head in agreement. "You are not as strong as your sister, but one day you will become a good king and protect your sister. She loves you very much." Tears rolled down her cheeks like pearls from a broken necklace. "Haruz, you are a man. Don't cry." "I won't cry." Haruz cried and jumped up. He rolled to the side and grabbed his sword in the snow. But just as he had time to touch the coldness of the sword hilt, a huge force pressed down on his head. He subconsciously raised his sword to parry. There was a harsh sound of metal rubbing against each other, and the huge force almost made him retreat. He looked up and found that the scene in front of him had changed. He held his sword and was crossing with the Halran Gaia in the hands of his teacher, Brando. The ground was covered with a thick red carpet of the Valhalla Holy Palace. Light and shadow intertwined in the palace. Between the light and shadow, Brando, wearing a light gray earl coat, was looking up at him calmly and said word by word. Haruz, what you can do depends on what you want to do. Swordsmanship is different from magic. It is a manifestation of a person's confidence. Teacher, can you defeat yourself? Then let's try it again. The pitch-black blade pushed his sword aside and stabbed at him from a tricky angle, like a venomous snake. Haruz just remembered this move and quickly turned his sword to block Brando's attack again. The two swords clashed and made a clear sound. After the sword, Haruz subconsciously took a step forward and wanted to attack first, but he suddenly realized something and stopped. He was stunned in place. Brando put away the Halran Gaia and laughed. Haruz, everyone will eventually learn how to use the sword. The sword will break, the swordsman will die, but they will not fail. Once you use the sword, you will undoubtedly win. The scene in front of him was blurred. Amidst the shadows, he seemed to see his sister's tall and straight figure standing gracefully by his father's side. It was the overlapping images of many times. The background was a bright spring day, a gentle summer night, autumn with falling leaves, and winter covered with snow. The scenes were in the Winterclaw Castle, in the Summer Court, and in the Kinten Palace. They kept going back and forth, as if brewing the bitterness and sweetness of time. He saw himself falling again and again and getting up from the ground again and again. He saw a disappointed shake of the head, but also saw a nod of approval. Finally, the scene stopped at the square of the Forza Holy Palace. He saw himself leading the knight to charge at the Empire's front line. Spears were shining, flags were fluttering, and ancient spirits were surrounding the battlefield, singing and singing. He saw the high-spirited, confident, and determined version of himself. That princess who was like a Valkyrie seemed to see a version of himself standing opposite to himself, the complete opposite of himself. Haruz, this mortal world is like a huge stage. One day, everyone will find their own place on it. You don't have to be discouraged by your weakness, because you haven't seen the hidden pride in your heart. A truly mediocre person will not be disappointed in himself. You will stand proudly in the center of the stage, and I will be proud of you. Haruz didn't know if he was still crying or if he should cry. The sword in his hand fell and disappeared in the darkness. Everything fell into darkness. When he opened his eyes again, there were shadows in his blurry vision. There was a burning pain in his chest. He vaguely heard someone shouting in surprise. Her Highness the Princess is awake. Then there was panic. He relaxed his consciousness and fainted again. When he woke up again, the sun was setting. At dusk, the setting sun floated on the sea and dyed the entire Forza Square with its fiery glow. The Empire's army had retreated long ago. At this moment, the entire Fathom port was peaceful. Although there was still smoke in the direction of the city, not a single flag of the White Legion could be seen. The soldiers were full of reverence as they told her that just after he led the knight to defeat the last attack of the White Legion, the Empire's army inexplicably retreated from the city. Almost everyone credited her for this miracle and called her the Miracle Princess of Fathom Port. But only Haruz himself knew that his teacher had done it. He had really convinced the enemy's army commander to bow down and surrender. The outcome of this war had been decided. After this battle, the White Lion stood proudly. Haruz sat quietly on the steps. The setting sun pulled his shadow long and thick on the square. No one dared to disturb her. The knight was both respectful and willing to stand guard for their princess. Not long after, a soldier brought Brando's communication crystal and said to Haruz, "Your Highness, the Lord wants to see you." Haruz nodded at him. Soon Brando's image appeared on the crystal. Brando looked at the princess, who was covered in blood, and shook his head with relief. "Are your injuries serious?" "Not serious, teacher. Fortunately, it's not serious. Otherwise, your sister will definitely kill me." "Teacher, I'm sorry. It's good that you know you're wrong. If you really die here, the royal faction will definitely think that I'm a powerful minister who wants to seize the throne," Brando joked. "Teacher, I know you're not. It's because you know that you can't easily give up your life." Brando became serious. "Haruz, this matter can be big or small, but Erwin must not fall into suspicion and internal strife again. You must be responsible for this, and you must be responsible for this kingdom. So you must think twice about your actions. Recklessness is not a quality that a good leader should have." But teacher, I've thought about it seriously. You said that I should be a flag. Under that situation, if I chose to retreat, then we would definitely lose Fathom Port. And if we lose Fathom Port, would our victory still be meaningful? There's no point. Brendel's answer was firm. Haruz was slightly startled. He had already regretted saying this. He had never dared to refute his teacher, especially when he had done something wrong. But for some reason, these words just came out of his mouth as if they had come out of his mouth without thinking. However, before he could regret it, Brando's answer had already surprised him. Never in his wildest dreams did he expect that Brendel would praise him instead of scolding him for it. Because you made the right choice, Brando suddenly smiled. Haruz, you're the best crown prince I've ever seen, and also my best student. I'm proud of you. Haruz opened his small mouth slightly. He did not know when a warm current surged in his heart. It was as if he was in an unreal world. After a long while, he replied in a daze, Teacher, thank you. You should thank your sister and yourself. Brando shook his head. Do you still remember what I told you? Haruz nodded heavily. The king did not need a longsword because he had his own pride. Chapter 1049. Whenever the shadow of the dragon swept across the hills and land, many descendants with the blood of the dragon would be born on the land. Astrologers claimed that the next generation born under the shadow of the dragon would have magical powers. And this was the origin of the year of the shadow of the dragon. 1,000 years later, the blue sea was still washing the coast of White City as it had done 1,000 years ago. Foam floated on the sapphire-like surface of the sea, leaving undulating wet marks on the long embankment of Anti-Squire. The highest wave had reached the bottom of the relief of the behemoth Leviathan carved in the sea of the long embankment. There was an iron ring there, used to mark the highest water level in the history of White City. The iron ring was now rusty and weather-beaten. This long embankment was built in the era when the Lord of White City, Terrence, forged swords into plows. It was connected to the stone trestle that extended into the blue bay in the distance. There were hundreds of ships anchored there, and the sailing ship of the Elven Court was unique among them. It had a long row of vertical sails, and the bow was curved like a saber. This fleet had crossed the sea from Eloranta to this place, and there were a total of 5 groups. On that day, the citizens of White City saw the fully armed Elven army disembark from these ships and then head east, batch after batch, and they never appeared again. More than half a month later, Rand once again stood on the edge of the long embankment and looked at the yellowed top of the sail. The elves had never returned, leaving only the empty fleet drifting in the bay like ghosts. It was not that no one coveted them, but all who dared to touch them received a stern warning from the Holy Church. The breath of the sea soaked his cheeks, bringing with it a moist breath. His heart was full of doubts. Why did the elves of Eloranta come, and where did they go? The empty fleet drifting on the surface of the sea seemed to be silently narrating something. Their whispers lingered above the bay like ghosts, sending chills down one's spine. Rand suddenly felt a wind on the sea, and a chill ran down his spine. He pressed his forehead, and his heart was slightly stunned. How could the wind blow from the sea at this time of the year? However, the sea breeze immediately became violent. The surface of the sea was dark, and white lines appeared on the surface of the sea. A strong wind blew across the bay, causing the flags on the sailboats to flutter loudly. The trees along the levee rustled. Rand felt his hair flying and quickly pressed down on his hat. The wind immediately lifted the corner of his shirt. He saw the sailboats in the distant bay begin to sway one by one. What was going on? Several workmen were shouting from the direction of the harbor, their voices carried by the wind from afar. They seemed to be complaining about the damned weather, saying that a storm was coming. However, his intuition as a sailor told him that this was definitely not the prelude of a storm. Moreover, the rainy season was over. How could there be a storm on the calm sea when autumn was approaching? He raised his head and narrowed his eyes. Suddenly he saw a few black dots appear on the horizon. They were elegant creatures flapping their wings. They were huge and beautiful, as if every muscle on their huge bodies was full of rhythm. The perfection and extremity of life were vividly displayed on their bodies. When they spread their wings, they seemed to cover the sky and the sun. The wind passed under their powerful wings, stirring up waves on the sea and piercing through the clouds. Huge shadows swept across the land again, just like in the past when everything was ruled. On this day, the dragons once again flew over White City. The water droplets gathered on the intersecting gray rocks. A line of fluorescent light shone on the edges, reflecting the magnificent scene inside the holy sanctum. Ding dong! The water droplets dripped from the dome and fell into the pitch-black sacred stone pool. Ripples appeared on the surface of the pool. Lord Sage, the outcome of the battle has been decided. Asabanto XI stood in the darkness and said in a low voice. A few sacred candles in the distance emitted a dim light, outlining his milky white satin robe. The robe hung down to the stone floor, and the bottom seemed to be stained with a layer of dark green. The towering figure of Eloranta stood there for a long time, her emerald-like eyes exuding a deep luster in the darkness. Her gaze passed through the balcony on the side of the Boulder Cathedral. There were towering mountains and lofty ridges, the shadows of the forest under the sunset glow. The last ray of golden light was swallowed up by the heavy clouds, and the stars fell from the red and purple sky, bringing with them a tragic color unique to this moment of impending departure. The light would disappear below the horizon, and then it would be a long night. After a long while, she slowly said, "What did you see, Your Excellency Asabanto? This is the news brought by my student. The Silver Queen has joined forces with the undead of Madara. At dawn on the 17th, an army of undead set off from the Argean area. On the 21st, someone witnessed their march near Ovchin. If I'm not wrong, the undead of Madara have already arrived on the battlefield. In the Evergreen Corridor, the army of Golden Mane Toquinen and Georgandy Ridge is marching north day and night. Once they pass through the gate of Arobigan, the forces of East Met's crews will reach more than 500,000. Asabanto XI took out a piece of parchment from under his long sleeve, read it carefully, and handed it over. But Elanta did not take it. Have you heard of the Battle of Urcados, Your Excellency Asabanto? She looked back and asked. Ding dong! Another water droplet fell into the pool. Asabanto XI raised his head in puzzlement. The candlelight, which varied in brightness, deepened the wrinkles on his face, as if they were carved by a knife. Are there any more variables, Your Excellency? But even if the eldest prince can deal with the White Legion, facing the army of Georgandy Ridge, it will be difficult for them to continue, unless... He answered hesitantly, unless Your Excellency intervenes. I won't intervene, Your Excellency Asabanto. I've already made it clear. If that's the case, I'm afraid it will be difficult for them. Asabanto XI frowned deeply and shook his head again and again. Your Excellency, not everyone is a miracle like the Flame King and the Battle of Urcados. It's precisely because it's impossible that it can be called a miracle. But miracles are difficult to reproduce. Elanta did not refute him. The last ray of golden light had already sunk below the horizon. The heavy twilight brought with it endless loneliness. The wind blew in the night, and the clouds in the sky slowly moved south along the ridge line. The moonlight quickly poured down, making the Calendula Mountains appear silver white. I feel a throbbing. The flaming blade Odorfice has been reborn in this world and has chosen its promised person. Asabanto XI was horrified. He looked up in shock. Your Excellency, this? There are heroes born in every era, Elanta replied softly. And the reason why an era is called an era is because it will replace the past. If you simply repeat the past, you won't get the answer. The Bugas are paying their debts. In the Holy War, they really shouldn't have intervened. 60 years ago, someone shouldered everything for them, and now they must repay this kindness. She turned her head, and a rare smile appeared on her determined face. The wind is blowing, Your Excellency Asabanto, do you feel it? Outside the Boulder Sanctuary, the wind was gradually getting stronger, and the trees were making frantic sounds. Countless leaves were swept up and flew into the sky, forming a torrent that fluttered and danced in the sky. Some leaves were even swept up to the balcony and scattered all over the floor of the sacred hall. Several monks hurriedly ran to close the door. But at this moment, the door at the back of the sanctuary was pushed open with a bang. Dragon. Teacher, Your Excellency, it's the dragons. Duruma, Arek, and Karsuk have all reported the presence of the giant dragon. The dragons are acting strangely. Did something happen? There's one more thing, Your Highness, we need an explanation. Princess Grafine finally raised her head from the pile of documents. Her beautiful eyebrows were slightly furrowed, and her gentle and resolute silver eyes had an imperceptible sense of worry. She looked at the noble standing in front of her, a member of the Nonin family. Behind him stood the Grand Duke of Grimoires. Perhaps there was someone else? She opened her mouth and asked, "I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said just now. Could you please repeat it?" The princess' voice was not loud. However, this caused the Purple Reed's Hall of Fort Ornevia to fall silent for a moment. The nobles, big and small, seemed to have realized something. They stopped talking tacitly and raised their heads to look in this direction. Some of them were bewildered, some looked like they were watching a good show. All kinds of faces with different expressions intertwined with each other. It was grotesque and variegated like a weird picture. The noble did not care about Princess Grafine's identity at all. He walked out of the crowd with his head held high, and proudly took out a letter from his chest and placed it in front of the princess. "Your Highness," he replied while pointing at the letter. "This is the report from the front lines of Bucci, Golden Castle and Karasin Highlands. The facts show that the undead of the Empire in Madara are amassing troops at the border. They are ready to make a move." Princess Grafine looked into the noble's eyes. She saw many people from the corner of his eyes. There were the envoys of the Grand Duke of Grimoires, the northern nobles, her grandfather Grand Duke Viro, and even the members of the royal faction. She saw Makarov and the others in the crowd. Those people first avoided her gaze, but quickly came over to her. She secretly clenched her fists. "There is also a report here, Your Highness," the noble continued calmly. "It says that Cruz has joined forces with Madara. Madara has sent tens of thousands of undead to the eastern Metz region to participate in the war. The Jorgendi Ridge and Golden Mane Toquinen legions loyal to the Silver Queen have also passed through the Gate of Arroyo. The Crown Prince of Cruz is about to be annihilated." "I already know about this report." Princess Grafine's face darkened. "What kind of explanation do you want to hear?" "Your Highness," the envoy of the Grand Duke of Grimoires suddenly spoke. "Erewhon is a small country. It is impossible for it to survive under the combined attack of Madara and the Empire. A small country should have its own way of survival. In recent days you have supported your count to stir up trouble in the Empire, ignoring everyone's advice. Now that your bold and reckless plan is about to fail, shouldn't you give us an explanation?" Princess Grafine was silent. Since the war at Fulton Harbor, both sides had used magic to block all magic communication in the area. For nearly half a month, there was no news from the battlefield. She shifted her gaze to Amandina, who was standing in the crowd. Amandina did not speak, but only nodded slightly at her. She did not know why, but she felt a slight warmth in her heart. She calmed down and coldly glanced at everyone present, then said, "The Count's actions are righteous and reasonable because Erewhon must protect its people. For this reason it will never bow to any bandits, regardless of whether it is the Empire or the undead. Count Tonagel has defeated the Empire once, and I believe that this time he will also stop the Empire. I want to tell everyone a fact. That is, Lady Martha once taught us that righteousness will always prevail." The hall was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. It was almost a confrontation, and the atmosphere was so tense that one could almost see the sharpness of the atmosphere. The envoy sneered. "Your Highness, words alone will not win the war. The Empire and Madara have joined forces, and the undead have tens of thousands of troops in the Argean region. Coupled with the powerful White Legion, please tell me, how will the Empire fail? Even if our Count Tonagel wins this war with Lady Martha's protection, how will he deal with the Lion Beastmen of Toquinen and the army of Jorgendi Ridge?" Speaking of this, he could not help but laugh very frivolously. "Of course, maybe our Count will kill the enemy with his will. Who knows, he can destroy hundreds of thousands of troops just by bragging. After all, Lady Martha said that righteousness will never fail." There was a low chuckle from the crowd. Duke Viro sighed and shook his head. "Princess Grafine, stubbornness is not a quality that a good ruler should have. Although you are not the king of Erewhon, you represent the face of the royal family. What you said before was too childish." Princess Grafine's face was as cold as ice as she looked at Makarov. Makarov frowned and said, "Your Highness, don't be too stubborn." Princess Grafine's face was filled with disappointment, and she said with disdain, "So you have been waiting for this moment for a long time. Your Highness, you should say that we have given you and your count enough chances, but your performance has disappointed us. What a disappointment. With a click, the main door of the Basil Hall in Fort Ornetto was pushed open. The one who came in was the Highland Knights Grand Commander Bunide, followed by 7 or 8 young Highland Knights. Bunide looked around with a cold smile. The most disappointing thing is that the one who saved Erwin is not the glorious royal faction, but a nameless junior. Some people are going crazy with jealousy behind the scenes. I'm afraid they will soon be swallowed by the flames of jealousy. Almost everyone in the royal faction, including Makarov, had a change of expression. Only Oberway's expression was normal, and he only frowned slightly. After all, being ridiculed like this was something that anyone would not be able to hold back. Bunide, are you crazy? Immediately, there were young royal faction people who wanted to step forward, but they were immediately pulled back by the people around them. What a joke, this was the king of the Highland Knight, known as the Resting One. He was one of the few elemental awakened elites in Erewhon. Ordinary people would only be humiliating themselves if they went up against him. Bunide did not even look at these clowns. Instead, he went straight to Princess Grafine, knelt on one knee and performed a grand knight's salute and said, "Your Highness, I have good news for you." Princess Grafine was slightly stunned. The Knights Grand Commander had already taken out a scroll of official documents and handed it over with both hands. Your Highness, Mihodafen's great victory. In the middle of last month, Count Tonagel defeated the White Legion in the Battle of Fatan Port, annihilated the undead army of Madara, and then set up an ambush to defeat the allied forces of Golden Mane Toquinen and Georgandy Ridge. As of the 7th of this month, the entire territory of Eastern Metz has been recovered and is under the control of the Empire's eldest son. The hall was dead silent. This is impossible. The Grand Duke of Grimoire's envoy rebuked loudly. This is a false military report. Bunide, what is going on? Princess Grafine frowned. Even she could not believe it. 3 battles in a row. Were the armies of the Empire, Madara, Toquinen and Georgandy Ridge made of wood? Although she had no doubt that Brando could create a miracle, there were only a few people in Fatan Port. It was already amazing that he could maintain a stalemate. Bunide smiled slightly and turned to explain to everyone. After Count Tonagel defeated the White Legion, he persuaded the White Legion's Grand Commander, Duke Ambuner, to surrender. With this information advantage, he blocked the news. At this time, the allied forces of Golden Mane Toquinen and Georgandy Ridge did not know at all. They went through the Evergreen Corridor according to the original plan, and in the end, they fell into the Count's ambush. Count Tonagel took advantage of the terrain advantage in the Arroyo Valley, and almost wiped out the Lionmen and Georgandy Ridge's army in one battle. What about the Dragon Queen? How could she deal with 3 giant dragons? The envoy screamed. But Bunide did not even bother to look at him. He turned his head and nodded to Princess Grafine. Princess Grafine was stunned. A complicated look flashed in her gentle silver eyes. She hesitated for a moment before gently picking up the scroll. Outside the palace, it was afternoon. Between the flickering lights, it was as if the shadow of a dragon was floating. P.S. Haha, today is the Holy Foundation Day. Did you guys get anything? Wawufa got Richelieu. This is not drawing the boat. The bishop's natal party is super happy. In order to celebrate, they have silently updated 1,000 words. This is their unique moral integrity and character. Chapter 1050. Princess Grafine and Amandina walked through the corridor one after the other. The soft light shone through the wide white arched window, leaving the window frame on the ground. Light and dust floated in the air. Your Highness, the royal faction has been acting strangely recently. Amandina suddenly said softly. For a moment, she was under the bright light, the golden buttons on her suit sparkling under the sun, but she quickly stepped into the shadows, her eyes emitting a deep light in the darkness. Princess Grafine paused for a moment, then stepped forward again, her voice cold and calm. They finally can't hold back anymore. How much time do we have left? Your Highness, the ministers are very dissatisfied with your excessive trust in the Lord. They are also quite dissatisfied with your sending Prince Haruz to cruise. The fact that the Lord is involved in the Empire's civil war has been a hot topic in the kingdom. Coupled with this incident, I'm afraid the ministers can't bear it anymore. Amandina hesitated for a moment. In fact, there are already some bad rumors that have begun to spread outside. Princess Griffine stopped once more, and Amandina stopped as well. The two of them stood by a window, and the light fell on Griffine's upper body. Her silky silvery hair shimmered under the sunlight, and on the chest of her dress was an aquamarine gem, reflecting the disdain on her face. Rumors? Are you saying that the bastards plotted to kill His Highness so that they can rightfully seize the throne? After saying this sentence, Princess Griffine felt that she was a little too vulgar. Her face turned red, and her skin was almost transparent under the bright light. The blush extended down to the base of her neck. How can I not know the dirty thoughts in those people's hearts? Amandina looked at the princess in a daze, and could not help but praise the princess' beauty in her heart. Your Highness. Amandina, the crux of the problem is the struggle for power, Princess Griffine replied softly. So no matter where your lord is and what he does, it will be the same. There will be no difference. Except for Lord Oberway, the royal faction is unreliable. Amandina was silent, knowing that the princess was right. Then we should prepare in advance, Your Highness. Princess Griffine nodded and continued to walk forward. Amandina, you should return to Valhalla. But Your Highness, the Lord asked me to protect you. Princess Griffine turned to look at Amandina with a serious expression. She couldn't help but smile. Amandina, who is stronger between the two of us? Amandina was stunned. The two of them were passing between two arched windows. Their graceful figures were hidden in the shadows behind the strong light, and only the sound of their footsteps could be heard. Without waiting for Amandina to speak, Princess Griffine continued. Amandina, Mr. Brando left you by my side because I do not trust anyone else, and I only trust you and Oberway. I plan to let Oberway go to Anthony and convince the Duke of Anthony, so I can only leave Valhalla to you. Besides, it is also your lord's property. Amandina's expression was dark and gloomy in the shadows. She also knew that Duke Anthony had just decided to pass the title of Duke to his eldest grandson, and now was the best opportunity. However, Your Highness, it is too dangerous for you to stay alone in Ranner. Don't I have Miss Freya by my side? She will protect me well. But Your Highness, you plan to let Freya go to Karsuk. Amandina was not tempted and replied with a frown. Your Highness, don't think that I don't know about this. Amandina, is this how you usually talk to Mr. Brando? Princess Griffine smiled. This is the first time I have seen such a serious aide like you, but I still have to thank you. Amandina blushed and said unhappily, Your Highness, don't change the topic. The front became bright again. Princess Griffine stared at the golden leaves outside the white window. Every leaf was a sign of the coming season. Don't worry, I'm safe here. The royal faction won't dare to do anything to me. But it's hard to say for you. Besides, I have to stay here. Erwin cannot fall into chaos. If I leave today, the kingdom will fall into chaos again tomorrow. Do you understand? Amandina did not say anything. She looked at Princess Griffine's thin figure and sighed softly. Your Highness, please ask for help from the Lord. Mr. Brando knows about our predicament. He will think of a way. I believe in him. Princess Griffine replied with a smile. Lady Mithril, thank you very much for your help. You are too kind. Lady Mithril removed her human disguise and revealed her original silver dragon form. She bent her neck slightly and looked at Brando with her mercury-like eyes. She gave a smile and replied, I did not keep an eye on the 3 traitorous dragons. This is the fault of us dragons, and we have caused a great loss to you humans. Fortunately, with your help, I was able to inform my clan immediately. She sighed softly. The way this dragon beauty sighed was extremely elegant, as if others would empathize with her and feel pity for her. It's a pity that the Dragon Queen has escaped. Even so, we will still stay in the mortal world for a while to search for her whereabouts. The mountain wind howled and seemed to become even wilder in this season. Near and far, the mountains were filled with an evergreen walkway. There was a hint of bleakness and coldness in the surroundings, as if indicating that summer was about to end. Autumn had already swept in with the cold wind from the direction of the wilderness of the 4 realms. In many places, the mountains and forests were dyed with a conspicuous red. The valley was still gloomy and gloomy. Corpses, broken armors, and flags were strewn all over the place, telling of the great battle that had taken place here. The corpse of a black dragon lay in the valley, and the fierce battle that had broken out in the vicinity had completely changed the direction of the nearby mountains. Not to mention the soldiers of Toquinen and Jorgandi Ridge. Thousands of dragon corpses were piled up at the bottom of the valley, and as for the Golden Mane Lionmane Beastmen, they were all dead. Except for a small number of Toquinen soldiers who had fled, almost all the forces of the Temple of the Earth had perished. The cavemen of Jorgandi Ridge fled relatively quickly, but the high-ranking troops were also lost. The remaining troops were not a concern, and it was even suspected that they would not dare to return to the surface. All in all, this was a rare victory, and it was not an exaggeration to say that the two alien armies had completely disintegrated. Although Brando knew that there might still be troops of Jorgandi Ridge and Toquinen in Anslova and Anzaruta, this battle was enough to scare them out of their wits. After this, it was hard to say if they would have the courage to go north. As for whether the White Lion Guard should go south, Brando did not think that he needed to help Lenoret reclaim her territory. He looked silently in the direction of the valley. This battle was, in fact, a little beyond his expectations. He only wanted to give the allied forces of Jorgandi Ridge and Toquinen a head-on blow, but he did not expect it to end up in a battle of annihilation. The wind whistled in the sky, and the branches of the dead trees on the top of the mountain were swayed. Brando had to hold on to his windbreaker. He looked up and saw a huge shadow descending from the sky. It was a few dragons of different colors. They spread their wings and circled above Brando's head, almost covering the sky. These dragons were the biggest contributors to the change of the war. Brando looked up. He and the dragons looked at each other silently. No one spoke first. There were a total of 7 dragons in the sky. Brando only recognized the red dragon in the middle. It had 2 heads, which was rare. It should be the legendary dragon Blaze. This deformed dragon was one of the strongest dragons, and one of the 3 longest living dragons. It was said that it was born in the era before the advent of chaos. At that time it was still the era when the Myrnas ruled the land. It had participated in the War of the Holy Saints and was one of the commanders at that time. "They are thanking you," Mithril explained. "You have done them a great favor." Brando retracted his gaze and looked at the Lady of the Silver Dragon curiously. "You dragons and the Bugas hardly intervene in the affairs of the mortal world. Ordinary people often think that you are proud of the world, but now it seems that you do not want to do so. Just 3 traitorous dragons, do they have such a big impact on you?" "I can't answer that question," Mithril shook her head. "But I can tell you that we do not intervene in the affairs of the mortal world because we are bound by a sacred oath." Brando was curious. What kind of oath could bind the dragons and the equally powerful Bugas? But if this oath was so terrifying, the Bugas and dragons did not seem to be completely uninvolved in the affairs of the mortal world. For example, this time they showed great flexibility instead of rigidly adhering to the oath. Mithril seemed to have seen through his thoughts and said, "This time the Bugas and us had no choice. Everything before our eyes is a continuation of the mistakes we made decades ago. Speaking of which, we all owe your grandfather a great debt of gratitude," the Lady of the Silver Dragon said. "This time we helped you win this war. On one hand, it was to punish the 3 traitorous dragons, but on the other hand, it was also to return the favor to your grandfather. However, the mistakes made by the Dragon Queen and the others are actually related to what you saw on the final battlefield decades ago, right?" Brando suddenly asked. Mithril glanced at him. "I can't say for sure." Brando suddenly saw a silver dragon flying lower in the sky. The dragon looked somewhat similar to Mithril, but its body was more majestic. A few silver tentacles hung down from its long and narrow dragon head. "That's my sister," Mithril explained. "She's thanking you for saving me." Brando shook his head. "Actually, it's not really a rescue. At that time, Lady Mithril and I were just allies. After all, in front of the 3 dragons, I didn't have much power to protect myself. But no matter what," the Silver Dragon Lady smiled and said, "it's a fact that you've saved me. We dragons have always been grateful." For some reason, Brando suddenly thought of a small figure when he heard this. He felt nostalgic and could not help but ask, "Lady Mithril, do you know a golden dragon?" "Golden dragon?" Mithril was slightly startled. Golden dragons and silver dragons are both superior dragons. There are very few of them among the dragons. We should be familiar with each other. Her name is Alaz. Oh, her? The lady of the silver dragon had a strange expression. She seems to have cheated during her coming-of-age ceremony and was locked up. That guy has already escaped, a voice in the sky said. The one who spoke was Mithril's sister. She nodded at Brando and said, Lord Blazegold is furious because of this. Little one, if you see her, it's best if you stay away. She's a big problem now. When Brando heard this, he immediately broke out in cold sweat. He had a feeling that the little female dragon would come looking for him. Of course, it was not a problem if she came looking for him. The problem was that according to Mithril's sister, she was now a ticking time bomb. Who knew if the golden dragon would vent its anger on him because of this? He could only pray that the little witch would not find him. At least not until this series of problems was solved. Mithril seemed to have seen through his worries and reminded him, don't forget, the Elven Queen also owes you a favor. The Wild Elven royal family has an heirloom treasure called the Dragon Avoidance Orb. It is said that it can make you completely disappear from the dragon's perception range. This orb is one of the gifts of the Dragon King Bahamut. Its full name is Green Field Trace, or Bahamut's Promise. It is one of the 2 sacred items of the Dragon King, along with the Crimson Blessing. This treasure is meaningless to the wild elves. They have a good relationship with the dragons and have no use for it. You saved her daughter, why don't you ask her to lend it to you? Brando was slightly surprised and could not help but look in another direction. In that direction, the little elf and her draconic companion were following behind a tall elven beauty with dejected faces. Behind her was an entire squad of wild elven guards and dozens of howling archers. These were the guards of the wild elven royal court, and the other party was the current elven queen. She had arrived with the dragons, and her purpose was naturally to find the wild elven princess who had been missing for a long time. It seemed that when they were discovered by Eloranta, the great sage had already told the queen the whereabouts of the little elf. Is it okay? Brendel looked at the naughty elf who was crying and unwilling to be separated from Kiara. He was very curious when the 2 of them became so close, so he asked Mithril. The silver dragon lady nodded at him. She'll definitely agree. That thing doesn't mean much to the wild elves. She can see the relationship between you and the dragon clan. Even if it's only for that reason, she'll still lend it to you. Also, Mithril blinked at him. You saved my life and helped us so much. Don't forget to ask Lai Yin for a treasure. If I'm not wrong, if you don't ask, they won't give it to you. You know, we dragons have always been very stingy in this regard. Brando could not help but look up at the silver dragon lady with great curiosity. But Lady Mithril, you seem to be an exception. That's because I don't have to pay for it, the silver dragon lady replied very slyly. Do you understand? It's now or never. A treasure of the dragons. Brando heard this and his heart skipped a beat. Oh. Chapter 1051. Thank you very much for saving my daughter, Mr. Brando. When he arrived in front of the Elven Queen of Eloranta, Brando's eyes lit up as he thought to himself, what a great beauty. The Elven Queen wore a silver laurel crown on her head. Her slightly curly blonde hair draped over her shoulders, and her light green eyes were as vast as the sea of stars, shining with the light of wisdom. A snow-white robe tightly wrapped around her slender body, and the opening in front of her chest would dazzle mortals. It seemed a little too revealing, but it made her look outstanding. A silver belt closed the deep opening, and when one looked up, one could almost see the flat upper half of her lower abdomen and faintly discernible cleavage. In his previous life, Brando had long heard of the Elven Queen's beauty, but he had never had the chance to see her. 10 years later, she went into seclusion, and after that, Princess White took over the fate of the wild elves from her hands, and the wisest princess in history was born. He couldn't help but look at the little elf with tears and snot running down her face, but at least until now, she was just a naughty child no matter how he looked at her. The Elven Queen gracefully bowed slightly, thanking Brando. Her appearance was somewhat similar to the little elf, but she looked much more mature, showing a classic beauty. Brando was a little surprised that the Elven Queen knew his name, but he thought that it must have been the dragons who told her. Your Majesty. He was about to speak. The Elven Queen smiled and interrupted him. The great sage has mentioned your name to me. Obviously there was only one great sage and that was Eloranta, The great sage actually knows my name? Brando didn't expect that he would be able to attract the attention of the world's top figure, and couldn't help but feel a little proud. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride for being in history and changing history. He recalled the night when he had just crossed over to Wuxia, facing the invasion of the Roman Black Rose. At that time, he was so insignificant that he couldn't even be considered a chess piece on the battlefield. But who would have thought that in the most inconspicuous corner of the world, an unknown young man would change everything? The Elven Queen saw the look on Brando's face and understood his thoughts. She couldn't help but smile, but she was gentle and didn't directly expose this beautiful misunderstanding. She only replied tactfully, "I knew you when you were very young." Brando's face suddenly turned from red to white, then from white to black. He coughed, felt his cheeks burning, and said with an unnatural expression, "Your Majesty knows my grandfather?" The Elven Queen gently shook her head. "Your grandfather is a hero, but I don't know him." "Then you are?" "Mr. Brando, there must be something important for you to come looking for me, right?" Brando looked at the Elven Queen suspiciously, not understanding why she wanted to change the topic, but this was indeed the question he was most concerned about. He nodded honestly and said, "It's not an important matter, but I heard that your Majesty has a dragon avoidance orb. Recently You want the Wizard of Oz?" "Yes. There are some problems." The Elven Queen replied with a smile. Brando's heart thumped. Although he had expected that it wouldn't be that easy to lend the dragon avoidance orb, he didn't expect the Elven Queen to reject him so directly. But after thinking about it, it was understandable. After all, this treasure had been passed down in Eloranta for thousands of years. As an heirloom of the royal family, how could it be lent just like that? But the Elven Queen's next explanation immediately made Brando understand the problem of his request. "Mr. Brando, don't you know that the dragon avoidance orb needs to be confirmed before it can be used? So if we give it to you, I'm afraid we won't be able to take back this treasure." Hearing this explanation, Brando's heart sank. He finally understood what the other party was talking about. The Wizard of Oz was a sacred item that needed to be recognized before it could be used. If the Wild Elves gave this treasure to him, it wouldn't be a loan, but a gift. At least before he died of old age or died an unnatural death, the Wild Elves wouldn't be able to take back this treasure. And the lifespan of a human with a certain level of strength was generally around 150 to 200 years. For someone like him who had activated his elemental activation, it wouldn't be strange for him to live for 4 or 5 centuries. At that time, it would be hard to say if he could still avoid the dragon avoidance orb. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty, I was rude." After understanding that his request was too outrageous, Brando didn't insist. He just replied with some pity. At the same time, he was already thinking about how to guard against the ticking time bomb that could appear at any time. However, it was at this time that the Elven Queen smiled and shook her head at him. "Mr. Brando, I didn't say that I wouldn't give this treasure to you." Brando was stunned for a moment and looked up at the other party in surprise. The Elven Queen smiled and said, "You saved my daughter's life and our race is indebted to you. And although the dragon avoidance orb is indeed a priceless treasure, it actually doesn't have much value to our race. The reason why we have kept it in Eloranta is because of the dragons. The dragons don't want it to fall into the hands of those who have bad intentions. But Mr. Brando is also a benefactor of the dragons. I don't think they will make things difficult for you. As long as Mr. Brando can get the consent of the dragons, this orb is for you to use." It turned out that the root of the problem was still the giant dragons. Come to think of it, the use of this orb was too much against the dragon race. If someone who was plotting against the dragon race got their hands on it, these giant dragons would inevitably have to live in a state of constant vigilance. This was undoubtedly unacceptable for such a proud species. Brando thought this through and quickly bowed to the Elven Queen to express his gratitude. In any case, the other party could have used this excuse to brush him off, but she wholeheartedly pointed out the right path for him. He couldn't help but be touched by her sincerity. But just as he was about to go and bargain with the big lizards who were famous for being stingy, the Elven Queen stopped him again. "Mr. Brando, please wait." Brando turned his head with some doubts and asked, "Your Majesty, is there anything else?" "Mr. Brando, the value of this orb is too low for you. If we only give it to you, outsiders will say that the wild elves of Eloranta are ungrateful. So whether the dragons finally agree to let you take the dragon avoidance orb or not, we still intend to give you another gift. This. Even with the mentality of a player who pursued maximum benefits, Brando couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. Your Majesty, this treasure is already very significant to me. He didn't lie about this. It was indeed very significant. If he didn't have this treasure, he might have died without a corpse because of his relationship with the little female dragon. So in a sense, the Elven Queen agreeing to give him the dragon avoidance orb was equivalent to saving his life. The Elven Queen smiled and interrupted him. Don't be in a hurry to refuse. This gift is not unrelated to Mr. Brando. It was left in Eloranta by someone related to you. That person wanted to return a favor to us. Today we're returning it to you. It's just right to return it to its rightful owner. Brando was slightly startled. He thought that the only person who had something to do with him and was so resourceful was probably his grandfather. But considering that the other party didn't know his grandfather, he couldn't help but be curious about the identity of the person mentioned by the Elven Queen. Wait, he asked. Your Majesty, is the person you're talking about related to my grandfather? The Elven Queen nodded without hesitation. Then what is his identity? Is he my grandfather's subordinate? To this question, the Elven Queen only smiled and said, I'm not too sure about this, but that thing has been left in Eloranta for many years. It has helped us a lot. I think you must have a use for it. As she said this, the Elven Queen's gaze extended behind Brando. Brando was too embarrassed to look back, but he could guess that it was probably the place where Princess Magadal, Eugenie and the rest were. He was a little confused about the meaning behind the Elven Queen's glance, but he didn't directly ask, What is that, Your Majesty? The Fountain of Singing. Have you heard of it, Mr. Brando? The Fountain of Singing. Brando couldn't help but gasp when he heard the name. How could he not have heard of the name of this thing? In fact, this thing had an even more famous name in Wonde, and that was the Fountain of Youth. It was said that those who drank its water would be able to retain their youth forever and live forever. Of course, this was an exaggeration. There was no such thing as eternity in this world. Even the undead of Madara would eventually walk towards destruction. But those who drank from the Fountain of Youth would be able to retain their youth forever without a doubt. Anyone who drank the water of the Fountain of Youth would have their appearance fixed at the moment they drank the water. If it was a child, their appearance would be fixed at the age of 15 or 16. Because of this effect, the water of the Fountain of Youth in Wonde was a rare treasure that everyone, especially the noble ladies, would go crazy for. In addition to this effect, the Fountain of Youth could also heal pain. Its effect might not be better than that of high-grade holy water, but it could restore limbs and injuries. Just from this point alone, people would be willing to pay any price to get it. But because the Fountain of Youth only appeared in the Black Forest, and its capacity was often extremely limited, most of the Fountain of Youth would only be able to fill a few cups of water before drying up and disappearing. Therefore, the water of the Fountain of Youth was extremely rare on the continent, only appearing twice in the year of the gathering stars and the year of the waning moon. Now the Elven Queen was telling him that there was a Fountain of Youth in Eloranta that had been used for nearly half a century, and still hadn't dried up. What kind of concept was this? What shocked him even more was that this thing was given to the Wild Elves by someone who was related to him. How big of a deal was this? No wonder the Wild Elves didn't hesitate to give him the Dragon Avoidance Orb. After receiving such a great favor, the Dragon Avoidance Orb was really nothing compared to it. As soon as Brando heard the words Fountain of Singing, he was immediately tempted. He couldn't help but be tempted. Not to mention that he had already promised to use the Fountain of Youth to restore Dilfrey to her original state to make up for her sacrifice in the Battle of Ampere Seal, and this thing might also be useful for the deer banshee's crystallization disease. But these were not the key. The key was that most of the Fountain of Youth was associated with another thing. That was the Singing Silver. And only half of the Fountain of Youth with the Singing Silver was qualified to be called the Fountain of Singing. This thing was much rarer than the Fountain of Youth. Even in the depths of the Black Forest, legends about it only existed in legends. And to Brando, the Singing Silver was associated with another thing. This was a secret that only a few people in Valhalla knew. Once he had an endless supply of the Singing Silver, Babu and his divine craftsmen could continuously repair the Valkyrie's armor. Valhalla would also have a true Tier 8 army, Brunhilde and her Valkyrie servants. Although reviving the Valkyrie's Valkyrie required the gold of the river, cutting off future fangs and windrider foals, the gold of the river was far less precious than the singing silver. Not to mention other things, the dragons would definitely have it. As for cutting off future fangs, Brando had already planned to ask the Kohua sisters for some of their fangs that had been broken in the past. Shouldn't be a problem. In this way, other than the windrider foals, the other problems would be easily solved. As for the Valkyrie's mounts, Brando could also buy them from the wind elves. Although the price was a little ridiculous, just a windrider foal could be exchanged for a tier 8 creature with outstanding combat strength. This was a good deal, and Brando had to do it no matter what. He couldn't help but be immersed in his beautiful fantasy. The Elven Queen seemed to have seen through his thoughts and had to remind him tactfully, "Mr. Brando, before returning the item to its rightful owner, I have to remind you about the problem with the Fountain of Singing." "Your Majesty, what do you mean?" Brando recovered from his fantasy and asked after a slight pause. He had never heard of any side effects of the Fountain of Youth. Because of this, people thought that it was a gift from Martha. The Fountain of Singing was actually discovered in the Argean region. It is a rare living spring, so it can produce spring water continuously. But because of some previous problems, the spring water has been contaminated, so there may be some side effects. The Elven Queen explained. It is said that the Dragon Clan had used a special method to extract the power of the spring water. As a result, it was contaminated by dark magic. Although its spring water still has the effect of the Spring of Youth, the body of the person who drank it might have some changes. Forgive me, but I don't quite understand. In short, people who drink it will immediately stop aging and maintain a certain stage. At the same time, they will lose all power, including natural and supernatural powers, and? Brando frowned. The side effects of this thing were a little too shocking. If the Elven Queen didn't lie to him, then people who drank it would become a useless person, at least according to the standards of this world. And they will lose the ability to reproduce. Oh. Chapter 1052. Although Brando did not understand why the Elven Queen wanted to emphasize this, it was indeed a problem. In Wonde, for the children of the nobles, losing the ability to reproduce was a serious matter. This was because while they enjoyed the power of the family, they were also responsible for the prosperity of the family. For unmarried noblewomen, infertility was even more serious, because it would make them lose the ability to marry into a political alliance. Although for Brando, who had half the soul of a modern person, perhaps losing the ability to make political marriages was not necessarily a bad thing. He had to admit that in Wonde's aristocratic system, this was almost the greatest value of a woman's existence. Many noblewomen valued it very much. It was actually related to their future status. He did not know what Dilfrey was thinking about this, but he had a vague feeling that as the future successor of the Yenbao family, Dilfrey might not accept the first condition. She had paid such a high price to learn demonic magic in order to revive the Yenbao family. How could she be willing to become a useless person? However, there was no need to reject this gift. At the very least, even if others couldn't use the spring water, it wouldn't be a problem for Aina. Aina was a card creature. Her power wasn't built on her own but was given by the laws. Therefore, it was very likely that she could use the spring water. The contaminated spring water was not harmful to her, and for a card creature, it did not matter whether she could reproduce or not. Moreover, he had confirmed with the Elven Queen that there was no problem with the mineral in the spring water. For the sake of the singing silver, he had to accept this gift. He had a feeling that the Elven Queen's last reminder was not without reason, but he could not think of a reason for it. When he asked again, the Elven Queen said that it was just a reminder. In the end, he could only think that he was too paranoid after going through several battles. The Elven Queen quickly transferred the Spring of Youth. Although the Wild Elves' spatial magic was not as profound as the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and they did not have a legendary teleportation spell like the Door of Flame, it was not a problem for them to transfer small objects through a short teleportation. Springs of Youth varied in size. It was said that the large ones could cover an area of several hundred meters. However, the Spring of Youth of the Wild Elves was very slim. It was only a few meters long and wide, and it was no taller than a person and a half. It wasn't difficult to move it over with spatial magic. When the Spring of Youth fell to the ground, Brando immediately discovered that it was indeed very different from ordinary springs of youth. The spring water of the Spring of Youth was clear and transparent, without any impurities. Even in a dark environment, the surface of the water sparkled with a silvery light, looking incomparably pure and holy. But this city of youth, the spring water had a strange dark red color, and there was a layer of faint red mist on top of the spring water. There was also a faint trace of a strong exotic fragrance, which smelled like the fragrance of laurel. Can this thing be drunk? Brando could not help but be very suspicious. No matter how he looked at it, this spring water looked like something that the demons had done. God knew what would happen if he drank it. However, the Elven Queen told him that other than the flaws she mentioned before, this spring water was no different from the real spring of youth. It would not cause people to fall into depravity or make them go crazy, although it did look very strange. As for the evil aura of the spring water, it was because of the dragons. They had once used this spring of youth to purify the power of the demons. However, the evil aura in the spring water had already been completely evaporated during the purification. The reason why the spring water had such side effects had nothing to do with the demons. It was because the sacred spring water had been damaged during the ritual. It was just a serious damage. The wild elves had been neutral most of the time in Wound, and this generation's queen and the future Princess White had a very good reputation in history. Brando believed that the Elven Queen had no reason to lie to him. He also saw a faint silver light in the depths of the spring water, and understood that it was the ore of the singing silver. This miraculous metal didn't only exist in the singing spring. In fact, it was an associated mineral with the dragonblood gem, which was rich in magic. However, the dragonblood gem was even rarer than the singing silver. Therefore, there was no way to obtain the singing silver. The singing silver was extracted from the ore. After it was refined, the whole body was silver white, but it had a natural magic texture. As long as it was placed in water, it would naturally produce beautiful music. That was how the singing silver got its name. However, Brando felt a little strange. It seemed that the elves had not touched the ore in the spring water in the past few decades. Could it be that they left the spring water in Eloranta just to wait for the day when they could return it to its rightful owner? He asked the Elven Queen this question, but the latter just smiled and did not answer. She told him that the spring water had more commemorative value than practical value in Eloranta. As for why, he would naturally understand one day. Brando felt that this answer was better than not telling him anything, so as not to arouse his curiosity and make him fall from the sky, making him extremely uncomfortable. He faintly felt that the Elven Queen might not be as kind as she appeared on the surface. She exuded a kind of black-bellied aura from head to toe. The dragon avoidance orb had always been with the Elven Queen. It looked like a transparent crystal ball, but the edges were plated with a strange green light. When Brando took it from Her Majesty the Queen, it was cold to the touch. Only then did he realize that this thing was actually made of liquid. When it was held in the hand, the surface tension was enough to keep it in the form of a water ball, but with a little force, the liquid would spread and wander around the user's body. The Elven Queen told him that this was the correct way to use this treasure. Let it spread into a thin layer of film, and hide the person who wanted to hide inside it, so that it could block all detection methods of the dragons. Soon, Brando recognized the orb as its owner under the latter's guidance, and then experimented with it several times. He found that the spread of the liquid could completely envelop a person and breathe without hindrance. It was just a little uncomfortable the first time, but he would soon get used to it. It was just that Brando always felt that it was his first time using it. The Elven Queen deliberately did not remind him, and as a result, he almost made a fool of himself in front of everyone and choked on several mouthfuls of water. But when he looked at the other party, the latter just gave him a kind smile. Now, Brando vaguely understood where the Elven Queen's bare aura came from. It turned out that it was a family inheritance. After thanking the elves, the negotiations with the dragons went much smoother than expected. However, the scene of a few dragons in a circle pushing the responsibility to each other made everyone's jaws drop. It was as if from then on, these elegant, powerful, and mysterious creatures were no longer as noble as before. Most people's impression of them suddenly collapsed and turned into fragments on the ground. Brando, on the other hand, was already familiar with the temperament of these flying lizards. In the end, It took half a day for the dragons to finally decide who would pay the reward for Brando's bravery. Their consensus was that whoever benefited from it would pay the bill. In the end, the dragons would pay half of the reward, and the silver dragon Lady Mithril, who was indebted to Brando, would have to pay the other half. Mithril did not expect that she would shoot herself in the foot. Her face was gloomy for the whole afternoon. Fortunately, she did not make things difficult for Brando. She only cursed a few times in her heart. Those damn old bastards. Her elder sister was obviously not excluded from this list. Brendel had a good impression of the Silver Dragon Lady and suggested to her in private if she wanted to give her half of the loot, but Mithril shook her head generously. "I won't cheat you of your money, little one. You're my savior, and I, Mithril, am willing to pay you back. I'm not that poor." Then she added, "Don't worry, my sister and I will each take half of the reward." Brando always felt that he had caused the dragon sisters to turn against each other. He could not help but feel very guilty. As for the part of the dragon clan, the remaining dragons argued again. Finally, before nightfall, the oldest two-headed dragon, Inferno, came to a conclusion. They would pay first, and then continue to argue when they returned. In short, he could not lose face in front of his human friends. Brando was helpless against these stingy fellows. In the end, it was unlikely that he would be able to obtain the so-called secret treasure of the dragon clan. He took the opportunity to make a request, hoping to get a portion of the gold in the river from the dragon clan. It would be best if they could give him a batch of imperial windfalls. Hearing this request, the dragons were relieved. They were obviously relieved. The gold in the river, also known as the witch's gold, had an extraordinary origin, but it was not rare. At least it was much cheaper than the rare treasures they had collected. Inferno had an expression of "You're not bad, kid. You can still see the big picture." After praising Brando, she agreed to his request and promised to give him 500 pounds of gold in the river. As for the imperial windfalls, the dragon frankly told him that they did not have any. Because the dragons could fly by themselves and did not need mounts, they naturally would not raise these things. However, he was given an additional reward of hundreds of thousands of gold coins, so he did not suffer a loss. Brendel did not care about the hundreds of thousands of gold coins at all, because he had been stunned by the unexpected surprise for a long time. He did not even dream that the dragons would give him 500 pounds of river gold with a casual swipe of their hands. Brendel could not help but feel a wave of extravagance wash over him. A sense of inferiority arose in his heart. One had to know that his original expectation was only a mere 50 pounds. He was glad that he did not take the initiative to ask. At the same time he thought to himself, "Martha above, how rich are these damn lizards?" If he did not know how terrible the golden folk were, he would have almost gone out to rob the dragons. Late at night, the dragons finally flapped their wings and left towards the north. The elven queen also took away the crying little elf. Before the elves left, Kiara comforted the elf that she would definitely go and see her. However, Brando suspected that this was purely a lie. When she returned to Erewhon, how would she have a chance to leave Cypher? After consulting with Dilfrey, the latter did not hesitate to reject the wild elf's spring of youth. "My lord, thank you for your kindness, but as the heir of Yenbao, I cannot become a useless person. Moreover, as the daughter of a noble family, if I can't have children, it will damage the family's reputation." After hearing the side effects of the spring water, Dilfrey calmed down. Since the battle in Ampere Seal, she had overdrawn her life force, and her health had been deteriorating. These days she had been plagued with illness and could hardly leave the bed. Even when she was on a diplomatic mission to cruise, she spent most of her time in the carriage. Even Edney, the most delicate of the ambassadors, behaved much better than she did. However, if she was asked to give up all her previous efforts and be a weak and powerless noble lady, she would never accept it. The heir of Yenbao could be a dead person, but she could not be a useless person. That would bring shame to the family. Brando understood that she valued the glory of Yenbao more than anything else. He sighed in his heart and did not try to persuade her again. "You don't have to worry. One day, I will help you find the real spring of youth, Miss Dilfrey." Dilfrey was slightly startled. She looked up at Brando, but did not refuse. Instead, she bowed slightly to him. "Thank you, my lord." After Brando sent Dilfari away, he found that the daughter of the Prime Minister of the Empire had come to his door. Delphian was supported by the Silver Dragon Lady Mithril. The latter had just quarreled with her sister, so she decided not to go back for the time being. She sat calmly in the wheelchair and said to him quietly, "My lord, I don't mind." Brando was slightly startled. He could not help but look at the daughter of the Prime Minister in the wheelchair. Delphian was wearing a purple evening dress. The black stockings under the dress outlined her perfectly proportioned slender legs, but it could not hide the ugly scars on her snow-white skin. Her graceful figure and ample bosom were proof of the charm this young girl once possessed. Although Delphian used her long hair to cover half of her face, it was still impossible to see the horror under her long neck. Almost only a small part of her face still retained its original human appearance. The terrible disaster had almost taken away all her pride in the past. She could barely stand up from her wheelchair. When she stood up from the chair, her legs were faintly showing signs of atrophy. Her left hand could not move at all, and her right hand could only do limited movement. Her neck could only turn at half an angle. At this moment, she was basically equivalent to a useless person. Although there were many conflicts in the past, Brando could not help but feel his heart palpitate when he looked at her at this moment. However, he did not see any despair on her face. In her deep purple eyes there was only calmness. Delphian quietly pursed her lips, waiting for his reply. Brando hesitated. Of course, he knew what the daughter of the Prime Minister was talking about. "Miss Delphian, I will not give you the spring water." "Why? You should understand." Delphian shook her head. "My lord, it doesn't matter to me whether I have strength or not. I seek another kind of strength, wisdom and power. It does not necessarily require strength. Oh, on the other hand, after Elman's death, what does it mean to me whether I can have children?" Brando could not help but frown at the mention of Elman. This was the root of everything. At that time, the daughter of the Prime Minister was hysterical like a madwoman. There was no doubt that love itself was not wrong. He hesitated for a moment before replying, "Miss Delphian, about Elman's death." "I know," Delphian coldly interrupted Brando. "My lord, I said before that I will not pursue this matter." Brando looked at her and frowned. It was difficult for him to see through this woman's thoughts. To be honest, he was still not completely at ease with her. After all, this daughter of the Prime Minister had changed her attitude too much. He really could not guess what she wanted to do. If she really let go of all her hatred, then she could have quietly left. There was no need for her to help her former enemy. As for the reason she said that she wanted to borrow his hand to save her family, it was a little too stiff. If he had not seen the wisdom of this daughter of the Prime Minister, perhaps he would have some doubts. But with the ability she had shown, it did not seem like she needed to rely on him. At least from an emotional point of view, he felt that he was not the best choice for her. Although Brando was not very sensitive to people's hearts, he was not stupid either. But what puzzled him the most was that at least until now, at least she had been helping him wholeheartedly. She had not done anything in secret. Thinking of this, he could not help but reply, "Miss Delphian, although I do not quite understand what you are thinking in your heart, I do not understand what your intentions are. Perhaps we are not on the same path. But as long as you are willing to trust me, I have promised to find the real fountain of youth for Dilfari. I will definitely restore you to your original state. Consider it as compensation." Delphian's eyes flashed with a deep light. "You do not owe me anything, my lord. If anything, it is I who owes everyone. I have caused a lot of trouble for you." She replied very calmly, "I also want to believe that my lord will keep his promise. To be honest, you are the most special noble I have ever met." "Yes, my lord." "Miss Delphian." "My lord, thank you for your kindness, but I have made up my mind." Brando looked at her and finally nodded silently. After getting Brendel's approval, Delphine let out a sigh of relief, and a smile of unknown meaning appeared on her face. The evening wind gently lifted her hair, and for a moment, it made her ferocious face not so ugly. The Prime Minister's daughter quietly looked at the sky from her wheelchair. After a while she opened her mouth and said, "My lord, this battle has come to an end. Basically, the expected goal has been achieved. After Miss Medisha cleans up the remaining undead in the Walach Pass, the Queen's plan in the East Mets can be said to be a complete failure. Brando nodded. The whole plan was not entirely his own. He was just the beginning. The rest of the plan was basically the work of the girl in front of him. Together with Medisha and Senior's modifications and improvements, it finally led to today's great victory. Delphien's sudden mention of this matter was obviously not without reason. He waited for her to continue. And, after the defeat of the White Legion, Jorgendi Ridge and Toquinen, it will be difficult for the Silver Queen to end the battle in Metz quickly. Delphine paused for a moment. I think in this case she may directly attack you. Attack me? Yes, in my opinion, compared to the eldest prince, you may be a bigger threat in the eyes of the Silver Queen. The war between the eldest prince and Her Majesty is just a civil war among the Cruz people. But between you and her, it involves the core issue of who is the successor of the Dark Dragon. You who have also inherited the power of the Dark Dragon, and with the support of the witches you may have the ability to challenge her current power. But this is not what I want. I understand, Delphine replied. My lord, the others around you also understand, but Her Majesty does not. Or rather, she understands, but this is not important to her. Not to mention, my lord is the descendant of the sacred swordsman Darius. As one of the few people who witnessed the truth behind the Dark Curtain, your birth and background are not inferior to Her Majesty's. If my lord calls for help, there may not be fewer people than Her Majesty's. Brando felt that he did not have the ability to do so. At the very least, Jorgendi Ridge and the Lionfolk would not listen to him. Not to mention, he had not even sorted out the forces in Erewhon. But he continued to listen to Delphine's analysis and asked, So, Miss Delphine, what do you think the Silver Queen will do next? Don't forget, it's not like she hasn't attacked us before. He was referring to the previous confrontation between the witches, which was almost a face-to-face battle, but the witches still failed. Yes, but if I were Her Majesty, I would change the method this time. Before this, no matter whether it was the assassination or the mobilization of the army, they all failed. This time, my lord, I have no choice but to let you fight on her home ground. But do you think I'm that stupid? Chapter 1053. As it turned out, it would. The smell of autumn was getting stronger by the day, and the heavy fruits on the branches hinted at the arrival of the harvest festival. After entering the month of Ariel 1, the crops in Metz began to reach their bumper harvest season. The military nobles continued to station their troops on the Western Front while they began to arrange for the farmers in their territories to carry out the autumn harvest. At this point, the Silver Queen's plan to attack Metz before the autumn harvest was completely ruined, regardless of whether it was the Eastern or Western Front. But it was not all for naught. After the great solar eclipse on Holy Day, the unnatural glaciers and snow from the Golden Needle Forest to the Silver Cove in East Metz gradually began to melt. The war on that day caused a devastating blow to the agriculture in this area. Both Fathomport and Ovchin encountered a food crisis, and the nobles had to urgently order food from Ludwig and Mihodafen to provide relief. The multiple solar eclipses over the past few days inevitably caused panic in this area. The astrologers told the people that this was caused by the chaos caused by the magic tide that only happened once in 1,000 years. Under such a background, the doomsday rumor spread like wildfire, and the forces lurking in the shadows took the opportunity to flourish. Because of this, the eldest prince had to impose martial law in Fathomport and Ovchin. This move actually slowed down the progress of their counterattack on the Eastern Front. But it was worth mentioning that after Medisha and Maynard recovered the passage to the Golden Needle Forest in the Latch of Wa, the military nobles stationed in the north took the opportunity to advance east and recover the Flowerleaf territory, eliminating the remnants of the White Legion that gathered there. Duke Vina obeyed Brando's orders and stationed a large number of troops at the Orang Pass. On the other hand, she ordered people to rescue the second daughter of the Archduke of Flowerleaf, Faina's sister, Ilya, who was under house arrest in Varasa Castle, and escorted her to Fathomport to meet her sister. There was also an episode that happened in between. After seeing her sister who had been imprisoned for many days, Faina lost control of her emotions. She hugged her sister and burst into tears. In fact, ever since Mihodafen had been locked up in the prison van, her mind had been constantly tense. Even after being rescued by the others, she was still worried about the safety of her father and sister. It was only when the situation in East Metz had reversed, when Medisha and Maynard had taken over the Latch of Tile and the passage to the Golden Needle Forest, and when Duchess Wayna had taken over the Flower Leaf territory, that the heavy burden in her heart had finally been lifted. However, the moment he saw his younger sister, the negative emotions that had accumulated over the past few days inevitably erupted. The Crown Prince's counterattack was slow, but in the second half of the month of harvest, the sporadic battles in the eastern Metz and Mihodafen had come to an end. Following Brando to the north, the southern nobles, who were now loyal to the Crown Prince, had even taken Asgard Fortress and brought the Evergreen Corridor under their control. Since then, the entire battle on the eastern front had come to an end, and Brando had followed the agreement and sent the White Legion, who had been recuperating in the prisoner camp for many days, out of the Metz area in Bucinian Forest. In fact, the issue of the White Legion's departure had caused quite a stir among the northern nobles. Many people, including Duchess Wayna, thought that these people should be detained until the end of the war, but in the end the Crown Prince Lenoret stood his ground and supported Brando's decision. Count Alcorn and other southern nobles also agreed with the decision. After all, everyone who had participated in the attack plan on that day knew in their hearts that although the White Legion had surrendered in the Battle of Fattarport, they had not really lost their combat power. Keeping them in East Metz was tantamount to a ticking time bomb that could explode at any time. What's more, Count Alcorn also believed that in the civil war of the Empire, their side must maintain a moral advantage, and must not lose the big picture for the small. In the end, his opinion reached a consensus among the northern nobles. Now that Count Alcorn had become Lenoret's right-hand man, he was obviously very satisfied with his current position. He had completely forgotten the scene when he stood on the side of the Silver Queen against Brando. He had repeatedly claimed in public that he and Brando were friends without discord. Brando was speechless about this guy's thick skin. But 2 weeks after the White Legion left Bucinian, bad news came. On the first day of entering Bankel, the White Legion's commander, Duke Ambunal, chose to end his life in a hotel in Gretcher. It was said that he did not leave any will. He only wrote a letter to his family and Her Majesty the Queen. In the letter to the Silver Queen, the Duke expressed his apology for failing to repay the trust of the royal family, detailed his lifelong loyalty and beliefs, and finally tactfully warned the Emperor of the Empire that the undead of Madara were not to be trusted. After receiving the letter, Constance sighed slightly, and then burned it to ashes. Later, she did not punish Ambunal's family for his performance in the war. She only ordered him to be buried solemnly, and then let Duke Ambunal's eldest son inherit his title. Brando did not feel much about Duke Ambunal's death. He only felt a little pity. At least the Duke was an upright person, but the upright people were inevitably tragic. In order to protect the White Legion, the Duke was even willing to compromise with his enemies. But when everything was over, he chose to use his own life to redeem his honor as a soldier. The news of Duke Ambunal's death reached Fathomport on the third day after the Harvest Festival. At that time, Brando was bored to death, listening to the decision of Prince Lenoret and his subordinates. In fact, it had nothing to do with him, because since the middle of this month, Erwin's people had already withdrawn from the internal struggle of the Empire. Although the fleet from Tanajil was still anchored in Fathomport, it could actually set off to return to Valhalla at any time. At this moment, the mission of the diplomatic mission had in fact been declared a failure. However, Erwin's people had gained more than they originally expected. As for how the Holy War would unfold in the future, this ancient kingdom now had more options. And just as Duke Wayna was passionately talking about the need to launch a counterattack on the Western Front, the door of the hall was slammed open by a panting Count Alcorn. He brought the news of Duke Ambunal's death and another news. On the third day after Duke Ambunal's death, the Silver Queen Constance announced a piece of news. In the political center of the empire that she ruled, a grand engagement ceremony was soon to be held. One of the parties involved in the engagement ceremony was the prince from the Latch of Wa, but the other party was greatly unexpected. The bride was not one of Her Majesty's daughters, but the newly conferred Countess of Wa Latch. About this mysterious countess, in fact, since the day she was conferred the title, there were all kinds of rumors among the people. Some rumors said that she was also a mountain person, while others said that she was not actually a citizen of the empire before she was conferred the title, but came from a state under the empire's rule. Each of these mysterious rumors made people more interested in the Countess. In all the areas under the Queen's rule, people were discussing the engagement ceremony. For a time, even their military failure in Metz seemed to have been forgotten. The heated discussion caused by the engagement ceremony even spread to Metz, Mahodefen, and Ludwig, which were under the control of the eldest son of the emperor. Although the people were a little quieter, the high-ranking nobles were also discussing the unusual move of the Silver Queen. From the beginning, this marriage was heavily political. It was obvious that it was to appease the mountain people who had just declared their loyalty to the Silver Queen, but what they did not understand was why the other party wanted to make such a big deal out of it. Was it just to cover up the previous military failure? The Cruz people did not understand, but some people knew very well in their hearts. Brando understood that this time, the Prime Minister's daughter was right again. After a brief hesitation, he immediately began to make arrangements. The confrontation between the east and the west of the empire had been formed. Although Lenoret's power was not yet stable, it finally had a foothold. He did not intend to let the Erewhon people fight for the throne of the Cruz people, so now it was time to pull back and leave. First, let Eugenie, Enid, and others take the little prince and leave the empire. The mission of the envoy group was over, and the little prince's mission was also over. Although Haruz also euphemistically expressed his intention to stay and advance with him after learning that his teacher was going to stay, Brando refuted him with the reason that a king must be responsible for his people. However, looking at the little prince's reluctant eyes, Brando's heart also warmed slightly. Since this diplomatic mission, the former had grown a lot and finally had the temperament of a king. This made him feel very gratified. At least it was worth the danger he experienced in the process. Although there were some troubles left, at least the princess on the battlefield that the soldiers talked about was one of them. He still had not figured out how to explain to Princess Griffine where the missing Princess Fuchsia went. Fortunately, he did not have to face the princess for the time being. Before the fleet left, Brando and Maynard met. After absorbing the war slate that day, the personality of Senior Allium Japonicum fell into a deep sleep and had not woken up yet. No one knew what kind of ability she had gained. Then Maynard's personality took the initiative of the body. As soon as she saw Brando, she gave him a loud slap in the face without saying a word. Then she gritted her teeth and looked at him. Her lips moved as if she wanted to say something, but in the end she did not say anything. But Brando read her lips and read the meaning of this sentence. Bitch. Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry. Of course, he knew that she slapped him because of Senior Allium Japonicum, but it was not his intention. He was also a victim. Fortunately, he felt a little guilty toward this young girl who had inherited his senior sister's soul, so he didn't make a fuss about it. Instead, he found it very interesting to see her face blushing all the way down to her neck after breaking through the cold and unapproachable aura. Miss Maynard, no matter what you think of me, this time Erewhon's domestic affairs are in your hands. Although Erewhon seems to be calm now, under the calm like a mirror, there are turbulent undercurrents. Whether it is the royal faction, the empire, or the undead of Madara, if any of these three parties is not handled well, the kingdom may fall into crisis at any time. Not to mention, All for One will definitely take the opportunity to stir up trouble in this situation. Maynard frowned as if she did not even want to look at him and replied coldly, I naturally understand, I don't need your unnecessary reminder. But she also understood that among all the ministers under Princess Griffine, only this one in front of her was the clearest about Erewhon's future, so she asked, If you have any thoughts, just say it. Brando nodded, satisfied with Maynard's ability to remain calm. Go and tell Her Highness, the undead will definitely start the second war of the Black Rose within this year. No matter what anyone says to her, don't let her believe it. The Roman Black Rose must give up all hope. Do you know the royal faction has always thought that you want to use the threat of the undead to expand your influence? Maynard looked at him coldly. You mean to make Her Highness completely oppose it? Those who think so are a bunch of short-sighted people. I believe that there are also people in the royal faction who can see all this clearly. Politics is an art of compromise, Miss Maynard, but not everyone has to compromise. I will pass on the message. Thank you. No need to thank me, this is not for you. Silently watching Maynard board the ship, Brando could not help but touch his cheek. Ouch. He could not help but grit his teeth. This woman really did not hold back at all, it really hurt a little. Although his defense was already beyond ordinary people, it was not able to block out the pain. Besides, Maynold's current strength was not bad at all. After absorbing the second slate, she had already faintly touched the field of elemental power. How is it, does it hurt? At this time, a somewhat teasing voice came from behind him. Count. Brando turned around and found that it was the little princess of House Cipher. Today, Chiara was wearing an exquisite princess dress and holding a purple parasol, looking like a doll. Her two ponytails shone under the golden sun. She raised her small face and looked at Brando with interest, a sly light flashing in her blue eyes from time to time. Princess Cipher of House Cipher, send my regards to your brother. I will, the mischievous little princess replied with a smile. But I have a question for you, Count. Brando made a gesture of invitation. Now you should know what my brother is planning. I just want to ask you, Count, do you plan to marry me? Brando almost choked to death. He could not help but cough violently. He had seen many questions that went straight to the point, but this was the first time he had seen such a straightforward question. Especially since the one who asked this question was just a little girl. Although he didn't know how old this little princess was this year. But looking at her underdeveloped chest and her height that only reached his chest when she stood on tiptoe, no matter how he looked at it, she didn't look like she was more than 14 years old. Your Highness. Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry as he coughed and replied, let's talk about this question when you are an adult. TSK. Chiara looked at him with disdain. Hypocrite, don't think that I don't know the dirty tricks of the nobles. I am a daughter of the royal family, don't you want me? Brando felt that if he continued, someone would call the military police. He quickly interrupted the little brat and said, enough, Your Highness. Humph. Chiara snorted softly and turned her head away, but her small face was tinged with a touch of red. She was a little unconvinced. My brother is better than your washboard princess in every way except for his eyes. And that Princess Wuxia. It is better to let him be the king than to let him be. Anyway, there are many people who would like that. Count, don't you know what kind of king Erwin needs? Brando shook his head gently. Miss Chiara, if your brother's surname was Corvado, then he would be an excellent king. The Cipher family also once ruled Erwin. But that was in the past. Miss Chiara, you are a smart girl, you should understand what I am saying. Chiara's eyes were a little gloomy. She bit her lips as if she was very unconvinced. But with her wisdom, of course, she knew that Brando was right. This ancient kingdom could no longer withstand another turmoil. She stood there, frowning and wringing her hands. Brando had never seen such a childish side of this little princess ever since he met her. His heart softened slightly, and he was about to say a few words to comfort her, but he did not expect Chiara to react first. She interrupted him and said, you don't have to comfort me. I don't want hypocritical comfort from a guy like you. I still have one more thing. Brando was slightly stunned. Chiara lowered her head, put her hands behind her neck, and untied a necklace. She put the necklace in her palm and then handed it to Brando. Here, this is the amulet my father gave me. I'll lend it to you for a while, you have to come back alive and return it to me. Brando felt that there was something wrong with her words. He looked at the necklace in his hand, which still had the residual warmth of the little princess's body. It was a beautiful crystal pendant, and it seemed as if there was blood boiling inside. He felt as if he had seen this necklace somewhere before, but he immediately saw the Cipher family emblem engraved on the base of the pendant. Only then did he remember the meaning of this necklace. This was the mark of the royal bloodline. Although he didn't think much of the amulet, Brando didn't expect that she would lend him such a precious thing. He could imagine the thought behind it. He was slightly moved. Your Highness! He didn't expect Chiara's face to be full of disgust. Quickly put away that expression, that's uglier than crying, it's disgusting. I just don't want to be a widow before I get married. Brando was suddenly speechless. He felt that if he continued to talk to this princess, he might really die of a heart attack. He didn't know where she got these strange ideas from. Where did she receive her noble education? Note 1. The local nickname for the autumn goddess in Metz. Chapter 1054. Scarlet had been having this fragmented dream a lot lately. Inside a tall and spacious Gothic temple, The broken arches and pillars looked like jagged bones floating in the darkness. A giant rose window hung above her head. Sunlight shone through the soft lead, turning it into a mix of amethyst and sapphire, forming a dark and mysterious light that seeped into the darkness. She was fixed on the cold altar, her hands and feet were tightly bound, and there was a strange dagger in her chest that was still dripping with blood. Her life force was slowly fading away. The spacious temple was filled with people, but no matter how much she screamed, no one paid her any attention. There was only one woman chattering beside her. The woman was shrouded in a thick shadow, so Scarlet couldn't see her face or hear what she was mumbling. After a while, the woman suddenly walked forward. Scarlet's eyes widened. She screamed and realized that she was sitting up in bed, drenched in cold sweat. The strange scene around her had long disappeared. The carved bedposts and light muslin curtains melted into the darkness. Not far away, a crystal ornament on the maple desk gave off a faint light. This was still her bedroom. The moonlight that seeped in through the window gently diluted the darkness. Her ponytail had come undone long ago. Strands of fiery red hair stuck to her face. Sweat soaked the blanket and it was cold. Scarlet was stunned for a moment. She hugged herself helplessly and shivered. "You had a nightmare again." Ovina appeared in human form and asked with concern. "Still that dream?" Scarlet nodded. "It must have been hard on you. You must have been under so much pressure recently." "That dream?" Ovina shook her head slightly. She bent down to open Scarlet's arms. She looked into her eyes and comforted her. The witches believe that dreams are mirrors of reality. Therefore, there is a saying that dreams and reality are the exact opposite. This dream means that your Lord will come to save you soon. Scarlet looked up. Her clear eyes were filled with a serious questioning look, as if she was asking, "Really?" Ovina couldn't help but laugh. She reached out and scratched her nose. "Of course it's real. Have I ever lied to you?" C looked at her suspiciously. Ovina blushed, which was a rare sight. She sighed and said, all right. Let's not talk about the cake I tricked you out of last time. That was just an accident. Why are you such a vengeful human girl?" "Because it's very important," CIA said in a very small voice. "This matter is very important to you, I understand. But do you still trust your Lord?" Qian nodded without hesitation. Ovina couldn't help but stare at her in shock. What a lucky guy. She sighed almost imperceptibly. "Since you're so sure that your Lord will come to save you, what else do you have to worry about?" "I'm worried, my lord." "Silly child." Ovina's heart softened and she patted her shoulder. "You're still worrying about others at a time like this. Don't worry, that guy will be fine." As if she had accepted Ovina's consolation, Scarlet finally calmed down a little. "Ovina, what time is it?" she asked. She felt like she had slept for a long time and her head was heavy. "Cheer up," Ovina answered. "It's dawn, Scarlet." The carriage creaked as it rocked back and forth. Behind the hood of the carriage was the autumn scenery of the outskirts of Bank Field. The dazzling golden light dyed the boundless land, and the horizon was dotted with farmhouses and windmills. Rolling clouds piled up to form the shape of mountains and rivers, and the wind pushed them forward slowly. The leaves of the tall spruce poplar trees on both sides of the road rustled. Sunlight shone through the branches of the trees, creating a scene of autumn. But no one in the carriage was in the mood to enjoy this rare scenery. The second-hand carriage swayed uncontrollably as it moved forward, as if it would break apart at any moment. The interior of the carriage was dark and dim. Bits and pieces of light shone through the holes in the hood and fell on the faces of Brando and the others, who all had different expressions on their faces. Who on earth bought this carriage? Vahina's face was pale. She couldn't help but ask the question. Before she could finish, she couldn't help but cover her mouth. Her chest churned and she rolled her eyes, almost throwing up again. But there was only acid left in her stomach. She had thrown up all her breakfast, including the red wine stewed beef and baked trout she had eaten the night before. The others were a little better, but they couldn't help but feel a little worried when they saw the young lady. Pamela. Brendel's expression was a little ugly. Although his physique was far superior to that of a normal person, this carriage was a little too much. More importantly, he had seen at least 3 rivets happily jumping off the pillars of the carriage so far. The whole carriage was as if it was possessed, clanking and clanking. Only God knew when it would fall apart in the next moment. There was still a long way to go before they reached the capital of the empire. Without the carriage they would have to walk for at least a day. But it was already past noon and the nearest inn was more than 20 miles away. "I'm sorry." The priestess looked very awkward under everyone's stares. She answered helplessly, "Because it's cheap. The goddess taught us." "It's good to be thrifty," Brando couldn't help but sigh. "But you've been fooled. How is this a second-hand car? This carriage is almost scrapped. And those 2 horses with Martha on top, I can't bear to let them continue to pull the carriage. If the Animal Protection Association, well, I mean the Druids, if those guys see this, I'm afraid trouble will come knocking on our door." "What's there to worry about a bunch of people playing with grass?" Andrique replied nonchalantly. "If they dare to come, I'll dare to kill them." Brando glared at her. The vampire sibling's strength had just recovered to the state of elemental awakening. He didn't know where they got their confidence from. "I'm sorry." Hipamra apologized very sincerely. However, not everyone was frowning. At least beside the vampire princess, Morpheus's attention was completely focused on the rays of sunlight that penetrated through the holes in the roof of the carriage. The spots of light fell on the tip of his nose, making it look like faint freckles. The vampire youth, who was even more beautiful than the girl, was concentrating on counting the holes in the roof of the carriage. He was completely focused on counting the number of holes in the roof of the carriage. He was muttering under his breath, but no one knew if he had counted to 71 or 72. On the other side, Brando saw the Roman, who was secretly laughing happily. Noticing Brando's frown and looking over, Romain replied guiltily and breathlessly, "Heh heh heh. Brando, if you had let me show up earlier. Heh heh heh. It wouldn't be so troublesome. Oh, my stomach, ha 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 ha. This carriage is actually very interesting, isn't it?" Ouch! Before she could finish her sentence, Brando pinched her face. Brendel frowned as he looked at the guy who was gloating over his misfortune. This guy had sneaked off the ship again. It was fine that he didn't settle the score with her, but now he actually dared to walk into the muzzle of the gun. He was simply asking for death. "Ouch, ouch, ouch." Roman tilted her body and was in so much pain that tears were about to fall. "Boo! Brando, I was wrong." "What were you wrong about?" "I shouldn't have said that it was very interesting when I was very serious. As a merchant, you should at least have the ability to observe people's expressions. Yet, I shouldn't have sneaked off the ship." Brando couldn't help but stare at her coldly before letting go of his hand. He knew very well that she wanted to stay with him regardless of the danger. He was touched, but this kind of undisciplined action was too lawless. It wasn't the first time she had done it, and she refused to change. After the Roman escaped from the clutches of the demon, she hurriedly shrank behind Medisha like a frightened rabbit. There, she frowned and stared at him with a very unhappy look. Medisha smiled helplessly. "My lord, don't worry. The Shire used magic to maintain the carriage. It won't be a problem to last until the outskirts of Rushta." Miss Roman was asked to stay by Lady Mithril. This time it's not entirely her fault. Brando frowned. The Silver Dragon had finally left the convoy 2 days ago. Before that, she had proposed to let Roman stay, but he didn't agree. Disguising as a caravan required a person who was truly knowledgeable, but he knew that this disguise wasn't really to fool the Silver Queen. It was just to reduce the trouble on the road. Besides, Delphian had also managed the business of the Nydevan family, so she could be considered knowledgeable. But he always felt that Mithril had a deeper meaning. Otherwise, she wouldn't have smiled and not answered his question. Now that he thought about it, the Silver Dragon might have known that the Roman had secretly used witchcraft to hide in the convoy. She might even have helped. What Brando couldn't figure out was why she did this. But now it seems that at least part of Lady Mithril's suggestion is very reasonable. The Shire suddenly smiled and helped Romain out of her predicament. Opposite him, Delphine, the daughter of the Prime Minister of the Empire, blushed slightly, but she did not refute. She only turned her head away silently. She was in charge of the family's business activities, but in fact, she was only responsible for the general direction and determining the strategic intentions. As for the minor details, she had capable servants to help her complete them. A few days ago, she confidently told Brando that she was fully qualified for this position, but in reality, In the end, when she arrived at the prosperous market of 11 Leaves City, Delphian was at a loss as to how to buy a second-hand carriage. She knew the prices of commodities in the sublime inland sea, and the future trend of the autumn and summer. She knew every detail of the burning, storage, transportation, and sale of charcoal in Cloak Bay. She knew when to stock up on goods and how to deal with the most powerful merchants in the empire. But she didn't know how to bargain with a skinny second-hand dealer who looked a bit like a monkey. In fact, she had offended the seller completely with just a few words. In the end, Hippamra had to bite the bullet and spend a lot of money to buy a second-hand carriage back, which was this old carriage in front of them. Vahina was still vomiting by the side of the carriage, and the inside of the carriage fell into an awkward situation. Brando shook his head. Who could he blame? Hippamra had done well enough. Before she was summoned as a card, she was originally an inexperienced girl. Most of the priests of Gaia were ascetics, and it was likely that she had never left the temple before. He lowered his head and refocused his attention on the metal fragments in his hand. These fragments were originally part of the flaming blade, and with Sydney's help, he could gradually feel that they were resonating with the soul of Odorfice in his body. It seemed that reactivating the flaming blade was just as Sydney had said. It was only a matter of time. But with the awakening of the soul of Odorfice, there was something that made him feel a little strange. At the same time when he awakened the soul of Odorfice, he felt that he was touching two other laws in the elemental realm. One was hot and unrestrained like a raging fire, and the other was deep and despairing, like the darkness of the abyss. He did not know whether this was an illusion or not, but these two laws were quietly increasing the power and realm of his main laws. In just 2 weeks, he felt that he had already faintly touched the true meaning of the Edict of Truth. This was actually a sign of reaching the peak of a realm. This fact scared him. In his memory, the elemental realm could only be increased gradually. In the game, the experience at this level would be converted into the power of order, and if he wanted to increase his level, he had to continuously complete missions and find opportunities to advance. For the natives, it was even more tragic. Usually, they could only increase their realm by understanding the laws. It was common for people like Veronica and Mephisto to be stuck in a realm for decades. At least Brando had never heard of any external force that could help to increase the realm of the elemental realm. He wasn't sure if it was an illusion, or if it was because the other half of his soul that belonged to Sophie was different from this world, so he didn't dare to tell Sydney this secret for the time being. He could only wait for time to prove everything. Do you want to know more about the Amber Sword? Open WeChat now, click on the plus sign at the top right, choose to add a public account, search for Kidian's Hongwenwang, follow the public account, and never miss a new update. Chapter 1055. The Dibor River sparkled under the setting sun. Every time this happened, the sunset glow floating on the surface of the river would shoot into the window, dyeing the hotel hall crimson. Through the window lattice, one could see the imperial capital standing on the horizon. It was a majestic shadow. The high tower and the city walls left a thick shadow in the setting sun. After wiping the last table, Seti stood up and wiped her sweat with the back of her hand. She looked at the door with surprise. The light at the door dimmed, and a few cloaked travelers walked in. They were guests. Seti was surprised that there would be guests at this time of the year. Since the war in Metz, the number of merchants on the road had decreased. The business of the hotel was getting worse and worse. The owner of the hotel even decided to close for the time being. The first person to walk in was a foreigner. He had long dark brown hair that was rarely seen in the empire. His face was somewhat handsome, although it couldn't be said that one would fall in love with him at first sight. At least his facial features were well defined and handsome. His brown eyes contained a divine light, and his expression was filled with warmth. It was as if one would feel a sense of familiarity at first glance. Behind him, there was a taller man who seemed to be his companion. He looked even more handsome and wore a hood, although he took it off as soon as he entered the house, revealing his slightly curly short hair that reached his ears. He looked around with a cynical look in his eyes. Behind him were a few girls. Seti could not help but feel strange. Who would bring so many girls with them at this time of the year? She could not help but suspect that they were a group of slave traders. However, she quickly realized that she was mistaken. These girls were obviously not simple. Just the look in the eyes of some of them made her not dare to look at them directly. She had only seen this kind of aggressive temperament from the real big shots in the city. How could they be female slaves? What a strange caravan. Seti noticed the caravan parked outside the hotel. Only traveling merchants would use this kind of caravan to travel to and from the bank district. The people who entered the hotel were Brando and his companions. Thankfully, the old caravan they bought from 11 Leaf Town had safely arrived at their destination before it fell apart. It was the hotel with the name Cat and Beard written on the signboard. Not more than 10 miles from Rusta, this old Renaissance building stood on the banks of the Silver Bridge of Holy Waters. It was plain on the outside, except that it was a little too shabby. The paint on the sign and door was peeling badly, and the roof was patched up in many places. But the windows were bright and clean, and there were a few pots of ivy on the windowsill beside the door. They were well taken care of by its owner. The inn's business seemed to be very quiet, probably because of its remote location. Delphine mentioned that this was the farthest inn from the east gate of Rushta. Only some merchants who did not have much money would stay here temporarily. However, this was the reason why they chose this hotel. Seclusion meant safety. The waitress of this inn was actually a mountain girl. Her long hair was as red as fire under the setting sun, and he was a little surprised. But when they went up the stairs, Seal turned back and said with a smile, "It looks like the little girl is suspicious, so it's just as Lady Sydney said, our disguise isn't very good." Brando came back to his senses and replied, "This is what I expected. I thought you would be troubled by this, my lord." "I won't be troubled by useless things. I just don't want to do useless things." "What do you mean by useless things?" The Shire sighed. "It's been a while since I heard a new word from you, my lord." Brando slapped his mouth in annoyance. "It's meaningless things." At this time, the Roman who was walking in front was paying attention to their conversation. Of course, she had been eavesdropping on their conversation. She had long forgotten about her anger at Brando in the carriage. When she heard this sentence, she could not help but deliberately fall behind and asked with her eyes wide open, "But how can it be meaningless? If Her Majesty catches us, will she hang us on the gallows? I heard that the nobles treat their prisoners like this. If that's the case, should we disguise ourselves or something? Because it's useless." Delphine, who was walking by the side, answered. Ever since she started taking the spring water, the scars on her face had faded quite a bit. At least she didn't look so hideous anymore. Some parts of her face had even started to shed, revealing the new skin that was as smooth as mutton fat. Most importantly, she no longer needed to rely on the wheelchair to move. Although she still had some mobility issues, at least she could move freely like a normal person. "Useless?" Brando nodded. "When we were on the road, did the patrolling knight not stop to check on us when they passed by us? Isn't that a good thing? The key lies in the frequency. We've encountered too many patrolling knights along the way. As far as I know, such knights would only do a routine patrol around the periphery of the imperial capital in the early morning and before the evening on normal days. This means that Her Majesty the Queen has strengthened the security around the imperial capital, but she did not order them to check on the floating population entering Rushta." "Is that so?" "Yes." Delphine nodded, but she glanced at Brando with some surprise. She did not expect him to be so familiar with this place. After all, many natives of Rushta did not know how the security around the imperial capital worked. The Shire smiled, apparently already knowing the answer to this question. "This means that the hospitable Her Majesty the Queen has implemented a method of security. It seems that she is very confident in her tentacles. She is only afraid that we will not enter the city. In other words, as long as we enter the city, she will be able to find us?" Brando nodded. "At least that's what the Silver Queen thinks." Romaine analyzed what she had learned and could not help but frown. "If that's the case, Brando, should we split up?" That means let me bring Brunhilde and the others into the city to attract the Queen's attention. You and Teacher Mephisto find a way to sneak into the city to save Scarlet." Brando could not help but feel angry and amused at the same time. He patted her on the forehead. "What are you thinking? Things are not that bad yet. I don't think the Silver Queen will make things difficult for us so soon." Roman hurriedly covered his forehead and dodged backwards, asking, "Why?" "I don't know why." Brando shook his head and replied softly, But I have a feeling that the Silver Queen is waiting for us to enter the city. After the sun had set below the horizon, the curtain of night had truly enveloped Rushta. In the darkness, specks of light floated up and down like stars in the distant horizon. Further away, flashes of light flashed across the pitch-black sky from time to time. Only those who lived in Rushta knew that it was actually the ornithopter of the Nazar people. As Rushta was near the border of the Nazar people, both sides had a large number of troops stationed at the eastern border. Even under the night sky, there were still groups of Pegasus night and magic-guided ornithopters patrolling the crisscrossing sky. Vahina stood by the window and stared at the quietly flowing river under the moonlight. She could not help but recall the scene of the last time she came to the imperial capital. Things had changed with the passage of time, and she had fallen from the status that was revered by the people to the clouds. Forget about maintaining the glory of the past. Even her father and brother were imprisoned in the belly of this terrifying beast in front of her. But she did not know why, but at this moment her heart was calm. Knock knock knock. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. Everyone in the room turned around and saw Medusa pushing open the door and entering the room in her martial attire. She closed the door behind her and breathed a sigh of relief before looking at Brendel. "My lord." "Medusa, how is it?" Brando nodded at her. He had sent her out to gather information, and from her expression, she seemed to have found something. Medusa replied, "It's all right, it's not too troublesome. My lord, the engagement ceremony will be held half a month later. At that time, there will be a banquet in the Garden of the White Rose in the St. Cantifer Palace. There will also be a celebration in the city. In fact, Rushta has been preparing for this since a week ago." Brando could not help but snort coldly. Obviously, he was very disdainful of what Cruz had done to Scarlet. It seems that the Silver Queen wants to use this to dilute the atmosphere in the imperial capital. But I don't think it will be effective. She doesn't even think about what she has done before. It's just to get rid of the dissidents. Delphian replied calmly. Medusa could not help but look at the Prime Minister's daughter. She frowned slightly before continuing her report. Countess Scarlet, is said to be living in a castle outside of Rushta. But when I went to see the place, it was empty. Is it fake news or has she been moved? Brando asked. She should have been moved, my lord. I was worried that the Silver Queen had left some spies in the vicinity, so I did not dare to stay for too long. But later on, I asked around and found out that there was indeed an important person who lived in the castle before, but they moved out a few weeks ago. It seems that the Silver Queen has already predicted our arrival. Otherwise, she would not have to do this. Delphian was indifferent to Medusa's gaze and analyzed with a calm voice. Brendel did not answer, but he did not have any objections. He had already expected this, and Amandina's analysis was exactly the same as well. What about the others? He asked again. Medusa turned her head. Miss Delphian, your father and grandfather are imprisoned in the Moss Castle. The commander of the Azure Army and the Duke of Flowerleaf are also imprisoned. But as far as I know, the higher-ups of the Holy Cathedral are not imprisoned there. As for the whereabouts of the Great Cathedral, not many people know. Many people do not seem to know what happened in the Holy Cathedral that day, nor do they know that the Holy Cathedral of Fire has now been divided into two. Hearing this, the Saintess of the Leo Palace, Sydney, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, frowned slightly. Phaina showed an anxious expression. Medusa, The Moss Castle is not a special prison, Delphian interrupted her. That is the palace of the royal family, so they are only under house arrest. After all, my father, grandfather, and the Duke of Flowerleaf did not stand out to openly oppose the Silver Queen. What about that person? Why are they being arrested? Romaine was counting the expenses of the recent days, and could not help but raise her head and ask curiously when she heard this. Because they did not immediately express their stance. The Silver Queen is going to do something too big this time. For safety reasons, she will first suppress all unstable factors to the minimum. Miss Delphine. Medusa's dissatisfaction became more obvious when she heard Delphine's words. According to what you said, I don't see any reason for you to choose his lordship. What the Silver Queen needs is the attitude of the House of Nydeven, and you represent the attitude of the House of Nydeven. I don't know what you're planning, but if you dare to harm his lordship. The Silver Fairy Princess pursed her lips and did not finish her sentence. But looking at her cold eyes, Delphian knew what she was going to say next. Brando was also slightly startled, and could not help but look at Medisha with some surprise. He knew that Medisha had never truly accepted this daughter of the Prime Minister, but this was the first time she had made her stance so clear. Delphian smiled, and only raised her head to look at Brando with her light purple eyes. She did not answer. Miss Delphian. Brando could not help but speak. Does the Count not trust me? But you do have more choices, don't you? The Shire finally interjected, choosing to side with Medisha. Delphian could not help but gently shake her head. Brando sighed. It's because of the change in the Ivy League, right? The Prime Minister's daughter turned her head with a you-knew-it look on her face. She hesitated for a moment and then nodded gently. But that is only one of the reasons. My grandfather never supported the late Emperor to pass the throne to the Silver Queen, so His Majesty supported the Pallet family to counterbalance the power of the Prime Minister. They used this method once when the royal family fought against the Holy Cathedral, but this time it was not as good as the last time. The change in the Ivy League. Mephistopheles, who had been silent all this time, suddenly spoke. Is it referring to that matter? Everyone's eyes were on him. I just happen to know. Mephistopheles, you're not a revenant from Madara? Brando only then realized that he did not know much about the vampire siblings. He knew about the past of Medisha, the Shire, the Nightsong Tiger, and Falerne. Even Hippamra would occasionally mention some of her experiences in the Holy Cathedral of Earth, but Mephistopheles and Andrique had always been tight-lipped about their origins. Before this, he had always thought that before they became card creatures, they were just ordinary dark nobles from Madara, or perhaps they had some background. But when he heard Mephistopheles' words, he knew that he was wrong. Mephistopheles was not a revenant from Madara. He was most likely born in Metz, or else he would not have known about what happened back then. Mephistopheles looked at him and nodded. My lord, you guessed right. My sister and I are not dark nobles from Madara. We were from Cruz when we were alive, and Metz was our hometown. So it wasn't a coincidence that I summoned all of you out of the tomb that day? Brendel nodded. I don't know much about the laws of the Cards of Fate, but perhaps that is the case. I understand, Brando replied. Since you were once from Metz, then you must have personally experienced that incident back then. Not exactly, but my sister Andrique and I did go through that dark period of history. I only remember that my family and friends died in that turmoil, even myself. That period of history was even crueler than the narration. Sir John Lorison's experience was just the tip of the iceberg. Mephistopheles smiled faintly. I really don't want to recall too much about that period of history. If it wasn't for my lord mentioning it, I wouldn't have even brought it up. I'm sorry. Brando did not expect that he would accidentally reopen a scar, and could not help but feel apologetic. It's all right, my lord. Time will heal all scars. Mephistopheles smiled. It was after the Holy War, and the Holy Cathedral of Fire was facing a general decline of faith and confusion. The undead and the cultists took advantage of the situation and stirred up trouble within the empire. The Holy Cathedral of Fire was most heavily infiltrated by All for One during that period, and there are still many historical problems left behind. I remember that during the most chaotic period, East Metz and Mihodafen, which are close to Argean, bore the brunt of the attack. There were even a few dukes who were bewitched. I heard about it, Vahina suddenly spoke. I heard from my wet nurse about the scene at that time. It was said that many people died at that time. Countless people were crucified every day, and the nobles were also full of assassinations and conspiracies. That was the darkest period of the Metz region. The countryside was the territory of the witches and heretics. They pulled out the tendons of the people and skinned them, using the harshest methods to torture the priests and believers of the Holy Cathedral. It was the same in the cities. Every day, there were witches being burned at the stake. Similar scenes were happening all the time. Mephistopheles recalled the scene at that time and could not help but frown. I never thought that such a thing would happen in the Empire. The Shire was a little surprised. Although he had heard of the turmoil, he did not experience it for himself. He could not imagine how serious it was. What happened after that? After that, it was the so-called Ivy League Rebellion. The chaos in East Metz turned into a real turmoil. Several famous nobles died in the chaos, and some of them were comrades and close friends of Nidevans who had fought side by side with him. Sydney spoke at this time. As a person involved in the Holy Cathedral, she could be said to be the one who knew what happened the most. In a fit of rage, the old chancellor was ordered by the Silver Queen to lead the army into East Metz and quell the rebellion in one fell swoop. He even captured 2 of the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders. 2. Brando noticed the number. The Lord of Filthy Blood, Lochlear, and the Withered Whip, Laney. But the latter escaped during the process of being escorted. He escaped, but my grandfather always suspected that Her Majesty let him go. Delphian finally spoke. At that time, Her Majesty and my grandfather had a great disagreement on how to deal with the cultists. In fact, according to the law of the Holy Cathedral, the cultists should have been beheaded long ago. But the last one escaped and the last one is still imprisoned in the Thorn Fortress. Most of the cultists and fallen Dark Lords were only sealed and not completely destroyed. Sir John Lorry's son was just one of them. This was the order given by the Silver Queen herself. She sighed. What puzzled my grandfather the most was that the Holy Cathedral actually backed down. This matter sowed a grudge between Her Majesty and my grandfather. But not just because of personal reasons, but because my grandfather saw that Her Majesty had other intentions. Although he was not biased towards the Holy Cathedral, but as a veteran of the imperial faction, he did not want to see the imperial family and the Holy Cathedral truly break apart, and thus lead the empire to eternal damnation. She took a light breath and said, "So everyone should understand now. Now that everything has happened, it's even more impossible for my grandfather to stand with Her Majesty. This is also the reason why Her Majesty secretly plotted to make me leave the capital. I should have seen through this long ago, but I was blinded by hatred." Me too. Vahina looked at Brando and gritted her teeth. "I can represent Mihodafen, Brando. I will stand on your side. I am the first in line to inherit Flower Leaf territory. I can make this promise. Miss Vahina." Medisha looked at her and comforted her. "Don't worry, we are not targeting you." "Thank you, Medisa." Her Royal Highness of Flower Collar couldn't help but blush. Delphian ignored Medisha's words. She turned to Brando and asked, "So my lord, what should we do next?" "There is still half a month," Brando replied. "Seems like there is still plenty of time. We will do our best to find out where Scarlet is being held. I will only consider launching an attack on the day of the celebration if there is no other choice. But before that, we need to find a way to invade Tessberg. On one hand, we need to save your and Vahina's loved ones. On the other hand, we need to gain more allies." He glanced at Sydney. "It would be best if we can find out where the Holy Cathedral's higher-ups are being held. Will they be killed by Her Majesty?" The Shire suddenly interrupted. "She will not do that." The Lion Palace's Saintess finally spoke. "Before we obtain the Holy Sword Oderfeis. Then let's do that." "We will split up and investigate," Brando replied. "Even though the Silver Queen is confident that she will be able to find us, we still have time to play hide and seek with her." He paused for a moment. "I will give her a surprise." Oh. Chapter 1056. P.S. If you want to hear more of your voices and receive more of your suggestions, please search for Kdred on WeChat and follow it. Give more support to The Amber Sword. Brando and the Shire walked aimlessly on Fragrant Street. It was the busiest commercial district in the imperial capital. The high-rise buildings on both sides of the street were hung with curtains representing the celebration. The craftsmen were making tables full of flowers and fine wine from the manors in the suburbs. The entire street seemed to be immersed in the atmosphere of the upcoming celebration, but upon closer inspection, one would notice some incongruous details. Few smiles could be seen on the faces of the pedestrians. Apart from the carefree children, almost everyone's face was more or less filled with sadness. It seemed that the heated discussion about Countess Latch's marriage had not really made people forget the war on the front lines. For those with a certain amount of assets, the war showed that their money was decreasing, but for those who lived in the imperial capital, or even the entire Bankel area to the Cloak Bay area, the war made their already poor lives even more difficult. Prices skyrocketed, supplies were reduced, men were forcibly transferred to the army, and the remaining people were almost unable to get by. The cost of the war was inevitably passed on to these people, and only a few could reap benefits or realize their ambitions. It looks like Her Majesty the Queen of the Kurlutzians isn't having a good time either. Charles looked around and couldn't help but comment. Brando nodded silently. But they were not here to comment on the Silver Queen's situation at the moment. Under his suggestion, everyone began to act separately. Vahina, Delphian, and the Roman disguised themselves as merchants. The Mehotafin family had a lot of influence in the imperial capital, and their remaining forces in the dark had been trying to rescue the Duke of Flowers in recent months. Vahina's task was to contact these people. Delphian's situation was similar. The Nidwin family's enemies were all over the court, but they also had many staunch allies. Some of these allies had suffered losses in the war, while some had avoided the limelight but were not trusted by the Silver Queen. There were always people who could be trusted among them, and the Prime Minister's daughter had to identify them one by one. Their mission was to distinguish between friend and foe, and rope in potential allies. This mission had a certain degree of danger, but if it was done well, they would not be deaf and blind in this huge city. As for Medisha and the rest, their task was to contact the Antiburo Duchy's envoy that had entered the city a day earlier, and confirm if Princess Magadal had already contacted them. This was a hidden move. Erwin's envoy had sided with the Crown Prince in this civil war, so their mission was declared over after the war in Metz. But this had nothing to do with Princess Magadal. She was the representative of the Antiburo Duchy, and at least for now, the duchy was still on the Silver Queen's side. So after the war ended, she still had to go to the imperial capital to meet up with her envoy. However, the nun princess did not support the Silver Queen in her heart, because she was a staunch traditionalist. With the direct descendant of the great sanctum, Sidney, on Brando's side, she would naturally side with Brando. Not to mention, the latter was her savior. Of course, she would not betray the interests of her country, but on this basis, she could provide some help to Brando and the rest. At least, she could be another eye for them, to prevent the two-faced nobles of Cruz from deceiving them. At the same time, she could also provide cover for them to enter and leave the city. Even though it was impossible for the Silver Queen to not keep an eye on the nun princess who was close to the people of Aween, that was not important. This city was filled with her spies, and if she was afraid of being discovered, she would not be able to achieve anything. In fact, Brando, who was very experienced in this kind of infiltration mission, don't ask where his experience came from, knew very well that it was not terrible to be discovered by Her Majesty. What was terrible was that the information was not equal. As for his own mission and the mission of the Shire, he did not mention it, but it was very important. He first walked around the city by himself, exploring all the places with hidden events and items in his memory. After all, it was rare for him to come to Lushta, and it was uncertain whether he would come here again in the future. He did not intend to leave the hidden places and treasures for the people of Cruz. After half a day, he had obtained a lot of things. Among them, he had obtained dozens of bottles of holy water number 2 and holy water number 3. Because most of the hidden places near the imperial capital were tombs or shrines, the easiest things to obtain in these places were all kinds of holy water and holy items. Although he inherited a lot of holy water from Amon's inheritance, after going through many battles, he had used up most of the high-end goods. This time, his harvest greatly supplemented his high-end collection. After all, the imperial capital was also the center of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, so the holy water produced in these places would not be ordinary. As for holy items, they were relatively rare in the Holy Cathedral of Fire, so most of the things he obtained were the most common goods, such as blessed prayer beads, holy bones, and similar things. These things could provide a lot of bonus to holy spells when fighting against demons and undead, but they were not useful on normal days. The only thing that pleased Brando was that he obtained the armor of Gundo and angelic wings from the tomb of Saint Fortuna. Saint Fortuna was a famous saint in the history of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, but the location of his holy body was a mystery for thousands of years. This mystery was finally solved by a cruise player from Cloak Bay, who accidentally found the tomb of the saint in the public cemetery of the Lion's Sacred Palace. From there, he obtained the armor of Gundo and the angelic wings that the saint used when he was alive. This discovery was also a widely circulated anecdote in the Amber Sword, because before this, most of the hidden treasures and discoveries were found in remote places. Very few people would look for lost treasures under the watchful eyes of the novice village. After all, most people's first impression would be that there would be no hidden treasures in their birthplace, or even if there were, it would only be some trivial Easter eggs. However, the discovery of the armor of Gundo and the angelic wings taught everyone a lesson. It proved that in the Amber Sword, the location of hidden treasures was only related to their history. In other words, in theory, as long as the game's historical background was in line with the game's history, you could even unearth the azure lance at the birthplace. After that, there was a wave of historical investigation and background exploration in the game. It was also at that time that players like Brando began to deliberately record a lot of history and information. It was worth mentioning that the tomb of Gerald and Butchie was also discovered in this context. The reason why the tomb of Fortuna was so famous, other than the background, was because of the armor of Gundo and the angelic wings that the player found. Of these two holy items, the lower value of the armor of stiffness was a fantasy-grade equipment, while the angelic wings was a genuine ancient artifact, even close to the quality of a divine artifact. Although the armor of Gundo was called armor, it was actually a pair of gloves made of an unknown silver metal. In addition to the amazing attributes of this pair of gloves, strength plus 35, constitution plus 40, 10% light resistance, as a fantasy-grade armor, it also had a special effect that made everyone envious. As long as there was light, the wearer could activate the special ability Gundo's Shelter. This ability was actually an invincible barrier that lasted for 5 seconds, had a radius of about 10 meters, and could not be moved. That's right, it was immune to all damage and control effects, lasted for 5 seconds, and took about 4 hours to recharge. Although it could not be moved if used well, it could be used to turn the tide of battle. At that time, when the Amber Sword was still in the era of major dungeons, this item was once recognized as a bugged equipment. The player who owned it was in a guild that was far ahead of the world in terms of PvE progress. This caused many protests from players, but later on, as more and more fantasy-grade equipment appeared in the world, various bugged special effects emerged, and the voices of controversy disappeared. After all, bugged equipment was called a divine artifact when one person had it, but when everyone had a divine artifact it was just SOSO. But if the armor of stiffness was just SOSO, then the holy robe of angelic wings was a little hard to accept, especially when it was in the early stages of the game, and was obtained by players almost effortlessly from a newbie map. This holy robe on the surface was a typical robe of a priest, but because it was discovered in the version where the ancient robe was not released yet, its attributes that were far beyond the standard of fantasy-grade equipment, will plus 21, bloodline plus 110, light affinity plus 10, were shocking to players at that time. Although the players of that era were not clear about the existence of higher-tier equipment after fantasy grade, they still gave this holy robe an appropriate title, Super Fantasy Equipment. Later on, when the Ancient Robe was released, the Angelic Wings was directly promoted to Ancient Robe. It could be said to be the only Ancient Robe in the whole of the Amber Sword that players had witnessed the promotion process, and its fame in the Amber Sword was imaginable. But that was not the main point. The main point was the special attribute of the Angelic Wings, Feather of Light. Your Light Affinity attribute can be converted to Wind Affinity attribute. This attribute was unknown to players for as long as 3 versions because in the early version, Elemental Affinity was in fact a kind of attribute enhancement. In short, it was to increase the proficiency of casting a certain type of spell, including damage, casting speed, elemental penetration, and so on. It sounded very powerful, but the actual effect was very deceptive, because the affinity attribute was calculated according to the affinity level, and the affinity level had an EXP slot. The affinity level would increase according to the proficiency of the EXP slot, and the affinity level would increase according to the elemental affinity provided by equipment or skills. In this way, the 10% increase in damage, casting speed, and elemental penetration for each affinity level seemed to be of little value. After all, a player could not pile up thousands of elemental affinity points. If that was the case, what other attributes would they have? Because of this reason, and in addition to the fact that most of the wearers of the Holy Robe were priests, how many of the priests' holy spells other than the Holy Cathedral of the Wind Empress required wind affinity? Even the priests of the Wind Empress spent most of their time dealing with the light element. This was the basic principle of holy spells. Although the priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire used all kinds of flames, it was actually just the light element's representation of the doctrine of the path of metal and fire. In Wand, as long as it was a holy spell, it would definitely not be separated from the light element. Because of this, most players thought that the Feather of Light was just a useless ability, and that the only reason the angelic wings had this ability was to balance out the high basic attributes of the angelic wings. In fact, until the end of War and Chaos, players still thought that the main strength of the angelic wings was its superior attributes. After all, the title of blank divine artifact was not just for show. However, with the appearance of the heirloom, more heirloom items began to appear in the eyes of the players. Gradually, the players began to realize that among the many heirloom items, the angelic wings attributes were actually just SOSO, and not even first-rate. Because of this, it was inevitable that the players would question, if the basic attributes of a piece of equipment were only average among the same tier, and its special attributes were trash, could it really be considered an heirloom item? Some players thought that this was a bug in the game company, while others began to suspect that there was something more to the Feather of Light. In the end, they really did research on it. In the era of the Slate War, the players began to grasp the power of extremity. After entering their own world of laws, the players began to be surprised to find that the laws were inclined towards the elements. This was actually very normal. After all, the entire WoN was built on the basis of the elements. Martha and the 4 great elven kings made a contract to use the elements as the foundation of the world, and then used the laws to restrict the flow of mana to create this world where all living beings lived. Therefore, the entire world and the laws that were built on it would inevitably be inclined towards the elements. Just like the Holy Cathedral of Fire built by the Flame King Gretel, and the Holy Cathedral of Wind built by the Wind Empress, their doctrines were all closely related to the elements, and the beliefs of the 4 great holy cathedrals were all one of the most fundamental laws of this world. Therefore, the laws that were inclined towards the elements were, in fact, shown in the background of the game from the very beginning. This was not surprising, but what shocked the players was that elemental affinity was also effective in the world of laws. And this effect was not only reflected in the strength of the elements, it could even change the nature of the elements. In other words, if a player's element power was a breeze, or a similar law that leaned towards the wind, under the influence of elemental affinity, it could even become a gale or a hurricane. This increase was not only a quantitative increase, but also a qualitative increase. Under such circumstances, the Wings of Light was extremely terrifying. This was because it could turn an element that leaned towards the light into a pure element that leaned towards the wind. Unfortunately, most of the cleric's elements were more or less inclined towards the light. In other words, with this holy robe, it was equivalent to having mastered 2 elements at the same time, one leaning towards the light element, and the other leaning towards the wind element. This was simply heaven-defying. It was equivalent to saying that if Brando's spacetime element leaned towards the light element, after the conversion of this holy robe, he could completely obtain a similar element that leaned towards the wind element. For example, the element of nirvana, which was not inferior to the spacetime element. Although these 2 elements belonged to the same level, their effects were completely different. For someone who mastered these 2 elements at the same time, the increase in strength was not as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. As soon as this fact was exposed, the angelic wings immediately returned to the throne of godly equipment, and even received the title of godly equipment. The reason why it was not a godly equipment was that it had extremely high requirements for the wearer's own quality. This was very easy to understand. A guy who only had the most secondary element wearing this holy robe could only be a rookie no matter how much it was converted. Therefore, this equipment was icing on the cake, and could not achieve the effect of sending charcoal in snowy weather. In theory, this holy robe was indeed the most suitable for Brando. After all, what element could be of a higher level than spacetime? Could it be more powerful than the spacetime element of the same quality? Unfortunately, the spacetime element being a light element was only an assumption. In fact, it was a dark element in WoN, so this equipment had no effect on it at all. Brando had actually prepared this equipment for Hipamra. Without a doubt, there was no one under him who was more suitable for this holy robe than Hipamra. Hipamra's element was a very high-level law of light and earth, holy white land. After converting it into the wind element of the same quality, it was almost equivalent to having 3 elements. Holy White Land's main function was defense and support, and most of the wind element was more offensive, so it complemented each other. After getting these things, Brando summoned the Shire. After all, he found a few hidden treasures in every place he went. This kind of bizarre thing was not easy to explain, so he could only find an excuse to send Seal away to do something else. Once he was done with his personal matters, he would summon Seal back. Anyway, the Planeswalker system had almost no distance restrictions. With just a command, he could summon the person with secondary authority to his side at any time. His next destination was Suman Street. At the end of the street, there was a magic item shop called Indulgent Rose. And this unknown little place was the final destination of his trip. My novel, The Amber Sword, will have more fresh content on the official WeChat platform. And there's a 100% chance of a lucky draw gift for everyone. Open WeChat now, click the plus sign at the top right to add friend, search for the public account Dread, and follow. Hurry up,